Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Echoes of the Fallen. The night air clung to my skin like a wet shroud, heavy and oppressive, as I stepped outside my childhood home for the last time. It had been 3 years since I had last set foot on this property, 3 years since I had buried my father in the small cemetery behind the house, and the memories surged back like an unwelcome tide, threatening to drown me. From the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. I turned sharply, half expecting to see a familiar face, but the yard lay still, illuminated only by the dim glow of the streetlight across the road. I had come back to empty the house, but the shadows whispered reminders of what lurked within its walls, echoing with laughter and sorrow. As a child, I had grown accustomed to the creaks and groans of this old place, to its secrets pulled in corners, but now they felt malignant, as if the house itself resented my presence. I opened the door, and the hinges protested with a long, anguished wail. Dust motes danced in the air, suspended in the twilight that filtered through the grimy windows. The scent of mildew and old wood clung to every surface, and my heart raced as I stepped inside. I expected to feel a pang of nostalgia, yet all I felt was dread. In the years since my father's death, I had tried to forget the stories he used to tell, tales that spiraled out of his imagination like smoke. He had often recounted the horrors that had occurred within these walls, the whispers in the night, the shadows that flitted just beyond sight. I had dismissed them as figments of a restless mind, but now, with the moon high in the house ensnaring me, I wasn't so sure. I made my way through the narrow hallway, past the faded photographs, each one a reminder of happier times. My fingers grazed the wall, tracing the patterns of peeling wallpaper. In the living room, I paused by the old armchair, half remembering the times I curled up in it with a book while my father told stories of the creatures that roamed the dark woods behind our home. His voice would soften, growing conspiratorial as he spoke of the veteran horror, the specter of a soldier who had never returned from war. They said he wandered the forest at night, seeking vengeance against those who wronged him. I shook my head to dispel the memory. I was no longer a child. I had fought my own battles, had seen horrors that made my father's tales pale in comparison. Yet, the silhouette of doubt hung over me, a persistent shadow that whispered I should not be here. I wanted to leave but knew I had to clear out the house first. I steeled myself and moved to the kitchen. The air turned colder as I entered, chilling me with an unwelcome embrace. I opened the cupboards, the door creaking in protest. Dust billowed as I rummaged through old dishes and faded tablecloths, remnants of a life that felt alien now. Each clang of metal against porcelain echoed in the silence, amplifying the quiet in a way that felt almost mocking. Just as I was beginning to lose myself in thought, a noise echoed through the house, sharp and sudden. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The sound was like the crack of a branch snapping, followed by a low thud. My heart raced as I strained to hear again, the hairs on my neck prickling. There was no one else here, I told myself. I was alone. Yet doubt lingered, gnawing at my resolve. Summoning my courage, I moved toward the source of the noise, which seemed to come from the basement. The door stood ajar, a gaping mouth ready to swallow me whole. I had always avoided that part of the house, even as a child. My father had said it was dangerous, that the basement breathed darkness, and he had spoken with a seriousness that sent chills down my spine. I hesitated. The darkness below seemed sentient, beckoning me like a siren. A part of me wanted to turn back, to flee, but another part, the one that had fought through countless battles, urged me forward. I descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath me, reverberating in the stillness. The air thickened, filled with a musty smell that clung to my throat. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the room nearly pitch black, save for the faint light that slithered through a small window. I squinted, straining to see. The thud had come again, this time accompanied by a dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. My pulse raced, and I cursed myself for being foolish enough to investigate. I stepped cautiously into the room, heart hammering, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Dust covered everything, layered like the memories I had tried to bury. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, and when they did, my breath hitched in my throat. There, in the corner, was a rusted trunk, its lid half open, and beside it lay a tattered blanket, drenched in shadows. I moved closer, drawn by some unseen force, and I could almost feel the weight of eyes upon me, watching from the dark. As I reached for the trunk, my hand trembled, and the dragging sound returned, louder this time. I whipped around, adrenaline surging through me as I scanned the room, but there was nothing, or was there? The atmosphere thickened, and I realized the stories my father had told were not just tales to scare me. They were warnings, echoes of lives interrupted by tragedy. The weight of history pressed down, and in that moment, I understood I was not alone. The house was alive with its memories, and as I stood there, I felt the chill of a presence that reached out from beyond, beckoning me into the depths of its dark history. The air in the old house felt thick and oppressive, like a wet blanket clinging to my skin. My heart raced as I edged further into the dimly lit hallway, where shadows danced along the peeling wallpaper. Memories of the previous night flooded my mind. My decision to stay at my late grandmother's home had been impulsive. I had inherited it out of obligation, a property that felt more like a ghost than a dwelling. I paused to listen, straining for any sound that might pierce the stillness. The house was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath, letting it settle in my chest before I moved again. Each creak of the floorboards beneath my feet echoed like a warning, urging me to turn back. But curiosity propelled me forward. The heavy scent of mildew lingered in the air, and I could see patches of darkened wood where years of neglect had taken their toll. I passed an old mirror hung crookedly on the wall, its surface fogged and tarnished. In its reflection, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a shape darting just behind me. I whipped around, but nothing was there. Just the hallway stretching before me, long and uninviting. I stepped into the parlor, my grandmother's favorite room. Dust motes swirled in the weak light streaming through the grimy windows. The furniture was draped in white sheets, ghostly remnants of the past. My grandmother had always said the room held secrets, treasures buried beneath layers of time. I hesitated, tempted to pull back a sheet and uncover the memories, but dread clung to me like a shadow. That was when I heard it, a soft whisper, as if the house itself was trying to speak. I strained to catch the words, but they were indistinguishable, a hasty rustle just outside my perception. I ventured toward the source, convinced my imagination was running wild. The whispering faded just as I reached the parlor door, leading me into the kitchen. It was filled with the scent of rotten wood and stale air. I flipped the light switch, but the bulb flickered weakly before dying completely, plunging me into near darkness. My pulse quickened as I moved further in, the chill of the floor tiles biting into my bare feet. I set my jaw and reminded myself that I was no coward. I had come looking for answers, though the questions were still shrouded in fog. As I rummaged through the drawers for a flashlight, I stumbled across a bundle of letters, yellowed with age and tied with a frayed ribbon. They bore my grandmother's name and the dates written in a hurried scrawl. In a moment of weakness, I opened one. The words inside were frantic, filled with a sense of foreboding. They spoke of things unseen, of shadows that whispered in the night, and a creeping dread that clung to her like a second skin. As I read, my fingers trembled. The more I deciphered, the more the shadows in the corners of the kitchen seemed to shift, as if drawn to my growing unease. I dropped the letter, my heart hammering in my ears. There was a knock at the door, soft yet insistent. I froze, torn between the instinct to hide and the lure of curiosity. The old wooden door, splintered and weathered, remained silent as I approached it. My breath hitched in my throat as I reached for the knob, an internal battle raging within me. Just then, I remembered what Grandma used to say about the house. "It has a mind of its own," she would muse, her eyes distant. "It'll know when you are afraid." I hesitated, but the knock came again, louder this time. My hand grasped the knob, and with a deep breath, I yanked the door open. The porch was empty. A gust of wind brushed past me, sending a shiver down my spine. I stepped outside, scanning the overgrown garden, the fading light casting eerie shadows on the gnarled trees. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice cracked, swallowed by the creeping dusk. A part of me wanted to retreat, to slam the door and lock myself away, but I couldn't. I remembered the letters, the warnings. I needed to know what my grandmother had been hiding. I stepped down into the garden, the grass damp beneath my feet. As I walked further into the fading light, I felt an unsettling presence, like a pair of eyes watching me. I spun around, peering into the thicket, but only darkness met my gaze. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches clawing at the heavens. I heard another sound, a soft rustling behind me. I turned to look, my heart racing as fear surged through my veins. I was alone. I had to be. But the rustling persisted, and I could feel something shifting in the air, something malevolent lurking just beyond my line of sight. My breath quickened as I backed toward the house, the whispers from the kitchen echoing in my mind. As I turned to flee, I caught a glimpse of something pale amidst the foliage, a fleeting shadow that felt all too familiar. It looked like a figure, ethereal and translucent, slipping from view as my heart hammered against my ribs. I stumbled back to the door, my pulse throbbing in my ears. Just as I reached for the knob, the door creaked open on its own, as if beckoning me inside. I didn't want to go back in, but something deeper than fear compelled me to enter. As I stepped over the threshold, the air shifted, wrapping around me like an embrace. A voice, a soft, melodic whisper, brushed against my ear. "You shouldn't have come back." The words hung in the air as I turned to face the darkness behind me, an unshakable dread settling in my bones. My grandmother's house had become a living entity, and I was now part of its twisted narrative. And whatever lingered in those shadows would ensure that my curiosity would cost me more than I had ever feared. It was past midnight when I finally managed to pry myself from the shifting thoughts that filled my mind like a dense fog. Sleep had become a rare visitor, and yet the weariness clung to my skin, a suffocating weight I couldn't shake. I had sought refuge in the cramped living room, surrounded by the remnants of my once bright life, scattered letters, old photographs, and half-empty coffee cups that had become like friends in my solitude. The darkness outside the window felt alive, thickening as if it were pressing against the glass, eager to seep through. I had always loved the night, its quiet allure, but now it was tinged with something sinister. I could have sworn I heard whispers, familiar yet foreign, curling around the edges of my thoughts. I tried to dismiss them, convincing myself that the wind was playing tricks, but deep inside, I knew the truth had a way of finding its way to the surface. I stood and paced the room, the floor creaking beneath my weight as I moved toward the bookshelf lining the wall. It appeared almost like an altar, littered with ghostly remnants of my past. There were dusty tomes of forgotten horror novels, their spines cracked and faded, tales of fear that had once gripped me with delight. Now, they felt like warnings, a testament to some lurking evil I could no longer ignore. As I scanned the titles, one in particular caught my eye, a book I had read countless times, yet the cover felt different somehow, as if it was trying to communicate with me. I reached for it, and an icy sweat prickled my skin when I realized it was not merely dust that coated the cover, it was something darker, richer. I pulled it off the shelf and dusted it off, the faintest flicker of a memory awakening. I recalled the night I first read it, the shadows dancing ominously on the walls, how the air had turned electric as the final pages came to life with vivid terror. I flipped through the pages, each one crackling like the dry autumn leaves outside. The words on the yellow paper twisted and writhed, sentences rearranging themselves until I could no longer read them. In a moment of panic, I slammed the book shut, but it felt as if the room had shifted, the air thickening to an almost suffocating density. A chill skittered up my spine, and I could have sworn I felt a presence behind me, an unseen audience waiting for the next act in a macabre play. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart sank. The shadows had deepened, twisted, coiling around the furniture like restless serpents. I shook my head, forcing myself to breathe, attributing the creeping unease to fatigue. Still, the feeling lingered, a tight knot in my stomach that wouldn't let go. In an effort to ground myself, I decided to make a cup of tea. The small kitchen was a beacon of normalcy in the chaos of my mind. I filled the kettle, watching the water swirl, meditative. As I waited for it to boil, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. My eyes were sunken, dark circles framing them like bruises, and I couldn't help but wonder how long it had been since I had felt truly rested, truly safe. Just as the water began to bubble, I heard a soft thud behind me. My heart skipped as I turned quickly, but nothing was there. The shadows remained still, their secrets locked away. I scoffed, shaking my head at my irrational fear. It was just a owl settling, I told myself, though the uneasiness prickled at the back of my neck. I poured the steaming water over the tea leaves and allowed them to steep, the familiar aroma flooding my senses. As I waited, I absent-mindedly glanced back at the living room. That was when I saw it, a flicker of movement, a shadow darting across the wall. My heart dropped, and I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath, but I couldn't shake the sense I was not alone. My heart raced as I edged back toward the doorway, straining to catch another glimpse of whatever had disturbed the silence. The air felt charged, vibrating with an energy that made my skin crawl. And then I heard it, a low, almost mournful whisper, barely audible. It was like the rustling of leaves on a still night, but the words were indistinct, ethereal. I stepped back, instinctively seeking the comfort of the kitchen, the kettle whistling in protest, begging for my attention. I clutched the mug tightly, my breath shallow and rapid. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to leave the house, to escape whatever had awakened within its walls. But something anchored me there, a curiosity mixed with dread. I had to know what it was. With a sudden burst of courage, I turned and walked into the living room. The shadows loomed larger and darker, a palpable presence that seemed to pulse with life. I hesitated, then took a step closer. The air was thick, a miasma of despair and something far older, a presence that felt both familiar and menacing. And then, just as I was about to retreat, I noticed the book again, lying open on the floor as if it had been cast aside. It beckoned to me, pages fluttering wildly despite the stillness of the room. The words were no longer jumbled, they now formed coherent phrases, each one dripping with a chilling promise. I felt compelled to approach, my hand trembling as I reached down to touch the paper. The words began to resonate, weaving into my mind like a haunting melody. I heard the whispers clearly now, speaking truths I had long buried. Each line felt like an echo of my fears, my regrets, a tale of the past that refused to remain silent. Then, with sudden clarity, I realized this was no ordinary book. It was a conduit, a bridge to something dark and powerful, a piece of my own soul caught in its narrative. I stumbled back, the mug slipping from my grasp and shattering on the floor. The haunting laughter that followed seemed to rise from the very shadows, around and within me, as I stood frozen at the threshold of my own awakening. The whispers turned to screams, drowning out my thoughts, and in that moment of overwhelming dread, I knew I was not just a spectator in this horror. I was part of it, caught in a web spun by my own choices and fears, unable to escape the veteran horrors I had long thought were buried. I had woken in darkness, the kind that felt heavy with the weight of secrets too dangerous to share. The air in the cabin was stale, imbued with the ghostly remnants of wood smoke and the tang of damp earth. As I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, the memories of the last few days returned with an unsettling clarity. The conversations I had overheard, the murmurs of the townsfolk about the old soldier, Victor, clung to me like a shroud. There were warnings, hushed tones that painted him as something other than human, something warped by a lifetime in the trenches of war. I had come to this corner of the world to escape my own demons, but the recounting of his tale gripped me tighter than my own fears. After a restless night, I ventured out into the crisp morning, hoping the light would banish the shadows that had settled in my mind. The woods stood ominously still, the trees towering like sentinels around me. I chose the path that led to the brook, wanting the sound of water to drown out the memories of Victor's hollow gaze. As I walked, I spotted something glinting in the underbrush. I crouched to examine it, brushing away the leaves and dirt to reveal a tarnished dog tag engraved with a name, Victor Hargrove. My heart raced, and a chill crept up my spine. I tucked the tag into my pocket and continued toward the brook, hoping to wash away the unease that had settled in my gut. The water was cold and clear, bubbling over smooth stones. I knelt beside it, splashing my face, letting the shock of the chill ground me. But as I looked into the water, the reflection morphed into something darker. Instead of my own face, I saw Victor, eyes wide and hollow, the stench of decay clinging to him as if he were rising from the depths. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as my breath came in ragged gasps. The brook was mere water, yet it held the weight of stories untold, secrets buried beneath its surface. I turned away, the fear coiling tightly in my chest, and I hurried back to the cabin. I needed to learn more about Victor, but each step I took felt like a descent into madness. Back at the cabin, I grabbed the flashlight and the tattered guide to the surrounding wilderness. I flipped through its pages, searching for any mention of Victor or the fragments of his past. Hours slipped by as I pored over the text, but the old soldier remained elusive, a ghost lingering at the edges of reality. Finally, a passage caught my eye. It spoke of a forgotten battle that had taken place nearby, a skirmish clouded in legend. The locals believed that the land was cursed, haunted by the souls of those who had perished. I couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was one of those souls, tethered to this place by an unbreakable bond. As night fell, the world outside transformed into a living tapestry of shadows. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful cry that echoed the secrets held within. I lit the lantern, its flickering light casting eerie shapes across the walls. The stories of the townspeople echoed in my mind, how Victor had returned, scarred and changed, but was he really gone? I set out again, determined to find him. The forest seemed to thrum with energy, the trees leaning closer as if they were a part of some dark congregation. I followed a narrow path that wound deeper into the woods, guided by an unseen force that pulled me forward. The air grew dense with fog, swirling around my ankles like a living thing. I rounded a bend and came upon a clearing, the moonlight spilling down like a balm. There, in the center, stood a figure cloaked in darkness. "Victor," I breathed, my voice a whisper carried away by the wind. He turned slowly, the shadows lifting from his face, revealing eyes that glimmered with an otherworldly brightness. "You've come for me," he said, his voice a rasp that sent shivers down my spine. I wanted to understand, I stammered, rooted in place as dread washed over me. "I am what remains," he murmured, stepping forward, shadows dancing around him like flames. "A veteran of a war that never ended." In his presence, I felt the air thickening, as though the very essence of the forest was alive, breathing in sync with him. "You're not just a soldier, are you?" "I am the keeper of secrets," he replied, a smile twisting his lips, a smile that held no warmth. "And you have been chosen to share them." A tremor coursed through me as I staggered backward, but the fog thickened, enveloping me in its grasp. The whispers of the trees grew louder, voices reaching out from the shadows, beckoning me to join them. "Join us," Victor urged, extending a hand that flickered in and out of existence. You, too, can become part of the story. I turned to run, but the ground shifted beneath my feet, roots sneaking out to entangle me. The forest was alive, and it wanted me. I could hear them now, the voices of those who had come before me, their stories layering upon one another, forming a cacophony that threatened to consume me. I fought against the pull of the earth, straining to break free, but Victor's gaze held me captive. You cannot escape. You are one of us now. The darkness closed in, and as I stumbled back into the shadows of the trees, I knew I was not alone. The secrets of the forest were waiting, and I was destined to uncover them, or perhaps to become one of them. The night hung over me like a weight, pressing into my chest with an intensity that felt almost suffocating. I had spent the past days scouring every inch of the old mansion, each room steeped in dust and secrets, but with every step, the house felt increasingly alive, as if it were watching me, waiting for something to happen. Shadows danced along the walls, morphing and twisting, feeding into the churning dread that had taken root in my stomach. After the unsettling encounter in the attic, I had decided to confine myself to the ground floor, convinced that it would be safer, more manageable. The air was stale but thick with an anticipation that electrified my senses. Outside, the wind howled, the ancient trees bending with age-old creaks, as if they were telling stories I didn't want to hear. I could almost hear the echoes of their whispers as I walked past the cracked windows, the moonlight filtering through the grime and casting ghostly patterns on the floor. I had taken to sleeping in the parlor, where the faded upholstery of the couch had begun to feel like my only comfort. But sleep eluded me, haunted by the memories of war, the shadows of my past melding seamlessly with the dark corners of this house. I shifted frequently, the hardwood digging into my body, but it was the sounds that kept me awake, creaks, echoes, and the faintest hint of laughter that tickled my ears like a lurking predator. One evening, while staring into the flickering glow of a candle, I heard it again, a soft giggle, too innocent for the atmosphere that surrounded me. My heart raced. I was alone, and yet it felt as though the house was home to an unseen child, frolicking just outside my reach. I dismissed it as a figment of my imagination, the echo of a mind unraveling under pressure. But deep down, I knew better. I decided to confront the source of that sound. With a deep breath, I stood and made my way through the dimly lit corridor that led to the staircase. Each step creaked underfoot, the noise reverberating off the walls like an alert to whatever thrived in the shadows. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, staring into the yawning darkness above. The upper floor felt like a different world, one ruled by unseen forces that had woven their way into the very fabric of my reality. Compelled by an inexplicable pull, I began to ascend. The air grew heavier with each step, the dim light of my flashlight barely penetrating the gloom. It felt as if I was moving through syrup, my heart pounding in my throat, the echo of my own breath deafening. At the top, a hallway stretched before me, lined with doors that stood like sentinels, guarding their secrets closely. Instinct urged me to turn back, but the giggle rang out again, this time clearer, more distinct. It came from one of the rooms at the far end, the door slightly ajar. I approached cautiously, the wooden floor protesting beneath me. My pulse quickened, a staccato rhythm of fear and curiosity. I tried to convince myself there was nothing to fear. Perhaps it was just a remnant of the house's history, like a whisper of the past reaching out to me. As I nudged the door open, the hinges groaned, revealing a small nursery, untouched by time. Dust hung in the air like lost memories, and the faded wallpaper bore whimsical patterns of toys and animals. My gaze fell upon the nursery's only occupant, a small rocking chair that seemed to sway gently, though there was no breeze. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking in protest, and the chair immediately stopped, as if it had sensed my presence. The giggle came again, but now it was accompanied by a whisper, a name. Emily. I froze. Memories surged, fragments of my sister's laugh that echoed through my childhood. The same name had haunted my dreams since the day I lost her, a specter of guilt that had latched onto my soul. I took a step back, uncertainty flooding my veins. How could this room contain her? It was impossible. Emily, I whispered, the name tasting foreign on my tongue. I felt drawn to the chair, its rhythmic rocking begging me to sit and listen. The air grew colder, and shadows lengthened, curling around me like a shroud. My breath came in quick bursts, and for a moment, I was engulfed in a dizzying wave of sorrow and nostalgia. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like thunder. Panic surged through me, and I lunged toward the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I turned back to the room, heart racing, and that was when I saw her, a figure in a white dress, her back to me, standing by the window, gazing out into the darkness. "Emily?" I called, my voice trembling. She turned slowly, the moonlight illuminating her pale face. It was her, the same cherubic features I had known and lost. Fear clenched my heart as I stumbled back, a desperate urge to flee coursing through me. The figure smiled, but there was something wrong with her eyes. They were vacant, hollow, devoid of the warmth I remembered. "You found me," she said, her voice soft and sweet, yet laced with an undercurrent of something darker. "I've been waiting." I wanted to scream, to break free from this nightmare, but my body felt heavy, weighed down by memories I no longer understood. I was ensnared in a web spun from sorrow and regret, and as I stood there, paralyzed, the room began to shift around us, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal lurking shadows that wriggled and writhed like tortured souls. "Come play," she beckoned, her smile widening, revealing teeth that glinted like shards of glass. The shadows whispered again, wrapping around my legs, pulling me closer. I could hear the laughter now, a chorus of voices rising, echoing through the room, blending with the shrieks of my past. In that moment, I realized I was not in a nursery. I was in a tomb, the grave of everything I had lost, and I was trapped within the very heart of my own horror. The last remnants of my sanity screamed for release, but it was too late. The child was here, and this time, she was not going to let me go. Story 2, Highway Haunt, The Last Delivery. I had never intended to become a trucker. In truth, the life of the open road had always seemed romantic in a distant, cinematic way. I imagined sunsets stretching across endless highways, the freedom of the wind whipping through my open window, and the camaraderie of fellow truckers. I had envisioned myself like those rugged men in movies, battling solitude and the elements. But that life was a far cry from the reality I faced as I steered my rig through the twilight of a forgotten stretch of back road. The hum of the engine was a constant companion, a mechanical heartbeat that lulled me into a rhythm I had only just begun to accept. I had taken to the job after losing my previous one, a dead-end office gig that had drained my spirit more than my paycheck. In September, darkness fell earlier, and the shadows grew longer. It was the kind of eerie quiet that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the landscape. Tonight, I was running late, my load of perishables destined for a small-town market that looked more like a relic than a destination. I pulled my rig off of the main highway, following the faded signs that led me deeper into the rural expanse. I glanced at the clock. I had about an hour before my deadline. Gritting my teeth, I pushed the gas a little harder, the engine growling in response. The blacktop twisted and turned, lined with gnarled trees that arched over the road like skeletal fingers. Fog began to creep in, sneaking its way along the pavement and obscuring the light from my headlights. A chill prickled at the back of my neck, but I chalked it up to fatigue. As I drove, the needle on my gas gauge dipped dangerously close to empty. I hadn't seen a gas station in miles, the last one having been a decrepit affair, its flickering sign advertising snacks that likely hadn't been fresh in years. The thought of being stranded out here in the dark sent a fresh wave of unease through my gut. I cursed under my breath, wishing I had planned my route better, when something caught my eye. A flicker of light danced through the fog, a beacon amid the oppressive darkness. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. As I got closer, it became clear that the light emanated from an old diner, its neon sign buzzing irregularly. Open 24 hours, it proclaimed, though I wondered how many customers it saw these days. The place looked barely functional, the kind of establishment that had likely seen better days decades ago. With a resigned sigh, I pulled into the empty parking lot, the gravel crunching under my tires. A sense of foreboding settled over me as I killed the engine. The air was thick with an unsettling quiet, save for the distant sound of crickets, chirping nervously. I climbed down from the cab of the truck, the chill biting at my skin. Inside, the diner was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows on the cracked linoleum floor. A single waitress stood behind the counter, her expression blank as she wiped down the surface. She looked to be in her late 50s, her hair pulled back tightly into a bun, a faded apron tied around her waist. The walls were adorned with mismatched photographs of old truckers, their smiles frozen in time, capturing moments from a life long gone. "Evening," I said, forcing a smile. She barely acknowledged me, continuing to wipe the counter. I cleared my throat, feeling the weight of something heavy in the air. "Can I get a cup of coffee?" She nodded slowly, moving to pour me a cup from a pot that looked like it had been used since before I was born. I noticed her hands trembled slightly, a nervous twitch that did nothing to quell my unease. I took my coffee to a booth in the corner, the vinyl seats cracked and peeling. As I sipped the bitter brew, I glanced around the diner, noting the stark absence of patrons. The jukebox sat silent, dusty records lining its top. Above me, an old clock ticked rhythmically, its second hand dragging through the silence. I could see my breath fogging in the cold air, and I realized the heat was off. "Is it always this quiet?" I asked the waitress, trying to break the oppressive silence. "Most nights," she replied, her voice a mere whisper. "Not many stop by anymore." "Must be tough," I said, attempting to sound sympathetic. "You have regulars." She hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. "Not any that come back." I frowned at her cryptic response, but before I could question her further, the door swung open with a jingle, and I turned. A man stepped inside, his presence filling the empty space like a dark cloud. He wore a worn trucker cap pulled low over his brow and a leather jacket that smelled of smoke and sweat. At first, he seemed harmless enough, offering the waitress a tired nod before taking a seat at the counter. He ordered without looking up, his voice low and gravelly. As he waited for his meal, I couldn't shake the feeling he was watching me, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. Panic clawed at my throat as I caught the waitress's eye. She was watching the man, too, her earlier calm replaced by a frail tension. "You should probably get back on the road, dear," she said softly, her gaze flicking nervously between the man and me. "What do you mean?" I asked, confusion mingling with dread. Her lips pursed tightly, as if she were about to say something important, but the man spoke up, his voice sharp and cutting through the air like a knife. "What's the rush? You could stay a while." There was something menacing in his tone, a darkness that crawled beneath his words. I could feel my heart racing, each beat echoing in the silence. Adrenaline surged through me, urging flight over fight. The waitress dropped a plate in front of him, an act of servitude that felt like an offering to some malevolent force. I really need to get to my delivery," I stammered, standing up too quickly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Sure you do," he said, a grin spreading across his face, but there was something hollow behind it. The air thickened with tension, and for the first time, I understood the weight of the shadows gathering around us. In that moment, as the fog crept in through the windows, I realized I had stumbled into something far more sinister than I had anticipated. The evening air was thick with tension, hanging around me like fog. I had spent the night nursing a stale cup of coffee at the diner, my eyes flickering from the clock on the wall to the door, half expecting to see old Hank shuffle in any moment. But the diner remained empty, save for the waitress, who was far too engrossed in her phone to notice my growing unease. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the first disappearance. I remembered the news reports vividly, a collective fear spreading through the small towns along Route 57. The latest victim was a young trucker named Kyle, who had been last seen leaving a rest stop just outside of Maplewood. The police had no leads, their efforts exhausted, and the local gossip had morphed into something sinister, a ghost story that churned in the belly of the town like an unsettled storm. I finished my coffee, the bitter taste lingering on my tongue, and pushed the mug away, my heart racing as I recalled my last encounter with Hank. He had been adamant about leaving the truck in the safety of the yard instead of going on another long haul. He had spoken of shadows dancing in the headlights during midnight drives, whispers that echoed in his cab, and the sense of being watched. I had laughed it off then, dismissing him as just another sleepless trucker finding ghosts in the mundane. But now, I wished I had listened. The diner's fluorescent lights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the linoleum floor as I stood to leave. I could still hear Hank's voice, rough and gravelly, his words intertwining with the sounds of distant engines rumbling down the highway. Before I stepped outside, I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool night air, and pushed the door open. As I walked towards my car, the gravel crunched underfoot, each step a reminder of my solitary existence in this wide-open space. I glanced up at the sky, a blanket of stars twinkling like distant eyes watching me. The road stretched in front of me, a serpentine ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. I hesitated, my instincts flaring, the hairs on my neck standing on end as I felt an inexplicable urge to turn back, to remain within the comforting neon glow of the diner. But I didn't. I climbed into my car, the engine sputtering to life, and my thoughts drifted back to Kyle. He had been a bright soul, always smiling, always ready with a joke. The police had found his truck abandoned at the rest stop, the radio playing an old country tune, but there had been no sign of him. I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and dangerous lurked out there, lurking along the stretches of lonely highways. I emerged onto Route 57, the rumble of my tires echoing in the still night. The landscape blurred into shadows, the trees looming like specters on either side of the road, their branches clawing at the sky. I drove, the headlights piercing the darkness, illuminating the asphalt ahead but leaving the edges of reality shrouded in uncertainty. Minutes passed as I navigated the turns, my mind lost in thoughts of Hank and Kyle. The radio crackled to life, a faint signal breaking through the static. On the lookout for a large dark truck, last seen near Maplewood. If anyone has information, the voice faded away, the weight of the warning hanging in the air like a thick fog. Suddenly, my heart raced at the sight of headlights approaching from behind me, growing larger and brighter. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the outline of a truck, its massive frame barreling toward me. The driver appeared to be swerving. My gut twisted as I recognized the familiar silhouette. It wasn't just any truck, it was Hank's. I pulled to the side of the road, confusion mingling with a burgeoning dread. What was Hank doing out here? I strained to get a better look as the truck sped past me, its trailer almost brushing the side of my car. My pulse quickened as I caught a glimpse of the driver, a figure shrouded in darkness, their face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low. The truck's tires screeched against the asphalt, a sound that echoed like a warning in my ears. "Hank!" I shouted, but the truck disappeared into the night, leaving me in stunned silence. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white as thoughts raced through my mind. I had to follow him. Something was wrong. With an urgency that surprised even me, I shifted into gear and turned around, my heart pounding as the headlights of my car cut through the night. The unease that had settled in my chest morphed into a frantic energy. I pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring in response, and the trees blurred into a dark wall around me. The road twisted ahead, shadows dancing in the periphery. I had lost sight of Hank's truck, but the echo of the engine remained, a ghostly reminder of what I was pursuing. Minutes dragged on like hours, and I fought to keep the fear at bay, but there was something primal lurking just beneath the surface. Then, there it was, a glimmer of red taillights ahead, stopped at the side of the road. I parked behind it, my heart hammering against my ribcage as I stepped out into the cool night air. The silence was deafening, a void that swallowed any sound but the hum of the wind. "Hank!" I called out, my voice trembling, and took cautious steps toward the truck. It sat ominously still beneath the moonlight, but I felt no relief. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. "Hank!" I shouted again, my voice cracking as I glanced around, searching for any sign of him. As I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. A deep instinct screamed that I should turn back. But curiosity and fear propelled me forward. I peered into the cab, the darkness swallowing me whole, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The seat was empty, Hank was gone. My heart sank as I stepped back, dread coiling in my gut like a serpent. I turned towards the woods, feeling an overwhelming urge to flee, but something caught my attention. There, etched into the dirt, was a single footprint, large, deep, and leading into the shadows. I hesitated, glancing back at the truck, then to the dark tree line that loomed ominously ahead. The hair stood up on my arms as a cold chill snaked down my spine. No more questions. I needed to leave. But as I turned to head back to my car, a low growl echoed through the darkness, a sound that froze me in my tracks. I knew I wasn't alone. The night stretched long and unwelcoming, swallowing the last remnants of sunlight as I stood outside the diner. The flickering neon sign buzzed overhead, casting erratic shadows that danced along the cracked pavement. My breath hung in the air, a ghostly plume of anxiety that gnawed at my throat. I should have known better than to stay out here, but I had this nagging feeling, a shiver crawling down my spine that told me the road wasn't done with me yet. As I stepped back inside, the warmth hit me like an embrace, but the familiar scent of grease and burnt coffee felt oppressive, suffocating. I took a seat at the counter, the leather cracked and peeling beneath me. The waitress, a weary-looking woman with dark circles under her eyes, shuffled over. I could sense her fatigue resonating in the quiet clatter of dishes and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper above the clinking of silverware. "Please." The word emerged almost involuntarily, a reflex of habit rather than a need. I felt uneasy under her gaze, as if she was weighing my presence against something unseen. She poured the coffee, the dark liquid swirling as it sloshed into the chipped mug. I wrapped my hands around it, relishing the warmth, but my eyes flicked to the door, half expecting someone or something to walk through. The diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of truckers hunched over their plates at the far end, their low voices a blend of gruffness and weariness. As I sipped my coffee, I recalled the strange events of the day. The hitchhiker, his eyes, dark and glistening like oil under moonlight, had unnerved me more than I cared to admit. I had turned him down flat, yet I felt that his presence lingered, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. The way he had studied me, as if he could peel back the layers of my soul with nothing but a stare. "Crazy night, huh?" one of the truckers called, his voice breaking through my thoughts. He was broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that told 1,000 stories. A trucker's life was one of solitude, an endless stretch of highway under an indifferent sky, yet his eyes sparkled with an unsettling excitement. Yeah, I replied, not sure what else to say. Out there on the road, he leaned in closer, as if sharing a secret. You ever hear any stories? You know, about things that happen out there? I mustered a shrug, though the pit in my stomach churned. Just the usual legends, I guess. He chuckled softly, an almost knowing sound. No, I mean real stories. Things that'll make you think twice before getting behind the wheel at night. I leaned forward, the coffee nearly forgotten. Like what? He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if the walls themselves had ears. You ever hear about the truck stop killer? The name sent a chill racing down my spine. I had heard whispers, scattered tidbits of horror that rippled through the long hours on the road. A man who preyed on weary travelers and lured them into his rig with the promise of safety. The trucker continued, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. They say he drives a dark blue Peterbilt, always parked at the lonely ends of the truck stops. Lures in the desperate, the lost, and they vanish. No one hears from them again. Just gone. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding against my rib cage. And they never find him? He shook his head slowly. Some say he's just another ghost of the highway, one of the many who've lost their way. Others say he's still out there, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. Are you serious? I blurted, though part of me was captivated. Dead serious, he replied, his gaze unwavering. You can feel it sometimes, the weight of eyes watching you when you're alone out there. Makes the hair on your neck stand up. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the dread that settled over me like a damp blanket. I'll keep my eyes peeled, then. The trucker just smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Good idea, darling. You never know who or what you might run into. The rest of the diner faded, the atmosphere thick with tension. I could still feel it, the lurking presence of something that didn't belong. My fingers tightened around the mug as I considered the stories swirling around me. It wasn't long before the truckers finished their meal and stood to leave, their chatter echoing in the emptiness of the diner. I watched them head outside, their footsteps fading into the night, mingling with the distant rumble of diesel engines. Suddenly, the door swung open again, and my heart leapt into my throat. I turned, but it was just a latecomer, a man covered in shadows under a worn baseball cap. He glanced around, his gaze darting quickly before settling on me. Hey, do you mind if I join you? He asked. Something about the way he asked sent a shiver down my spine, but I nodded nonetheless. He slid onto the stool next to me, and I felt the air shift, the temperature dropping as if the very essence of the diner had darkened. Long night? He asked, an unsettling smile curling across his lips. I opened my mouth to answer, ready to reassure myself that it was just the coffee and fatigue playing tricks on my mind, but the words caught in my throat as a familiar chill raced down my spine. The stories, the warning, the hitchhiker, I was no longer just a spectator in this tale of horror. Something was coming for me, and I could feel it stirring in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I woke to the sun filtering through the grimy windshield of the truck, its rays sifting through the dust like fingers raking through a tangled mess of hair. The air inside was stale, mixed with the faintest whiff of diesel and something else I couldn't quite place. I blinked against the sunlight, struggling to remember where I was and what had happened the night before. The memories crashed over me in waves running, the man in the shadows, the metallic taste of terror clinging to my tongue. The truck had rolled to a stop at a rest area, the kind of desolate place with yellowed restrooms and a vending machine that had seen better days. I had parked there after my frantic drive, needing a few moments to catch my breath. Now, the stillness outside felt oppressive, as if the world was holding its breath in anticipation. I checked the time on the dashboard. It was already past noon. I climbed out, the chill of the morning air hitting me square in the chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with unease. I glanced around, half expecting to see the man from last night lurking just beyond the trees, but only the silent expanse of the parking lot greeted me. The other trucks were silent giants, some with their engines still rumbling, but the drivers remained hidden behind their tinted windows. I dragged my feet toward the restroom, every step feeling like I was intruding on a sacred space. As I pushed open the door, the musty smell hit me like a slap. Inside, the flickering fluorescent lights cast sickly shadows across the grimy tiles. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping to wash away the lingering panic. It didn't work. The reflection staring back at me was gaunt and haunted, eyes wide and bloodshot. I needed to keep moving. This place felt wrong, like a trap that had been set just for me. I trudged back out to my truck, scanning the area for any signs of danger. That's when I noticed him, a figure leaning against one of the other trucks, arms crossed, gazing directly at me. The man was tall, clad in a weathered leather jacket, his face obscured by the brim of a worn cap. There was something unnerving in the way he stood, as if he was waiting for me to make a move. My heart hammered in my chest. I turned away quickly and slid into the cab, locking the door as if that could keep him out. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I tried to turn the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, sending a jolt of relief through me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my stomach dropped. The man had moved closer, his shadow stretching over the pavement, eyes fixed on me with a predatory intensity. I could sense his curiosity mixed with something darker. Desperate to escape, I shifted into gear and pulled out of the lot, the tires crunching against the gravel as I hit the road. The scenery blurred outside, endless stretches of asphalt framed by thick trees, their branches clawing at the sky. I felt a strange mix of freedom and dread, like I had just stepped out of one nightmare into another. As the miles unfolded, the unease settled back into my bones. I couldn't stop glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see that figure trailing behind me. I knew I should call the police, but who would believe me? I was just a lone driver, a face in the crowd of truckers disappearing into the night. I decided to pull into the next way station. Maybe some other drivers would be around. Maybe I'd find a semblance of safety, a connection. The station loomed ahead, a battered building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. I parked among a few other trucks, the heavy smell of oil and rubber filling the air. When I stepped out, the weight of my anxiety settled in my chest. As I entered the station, the bell above the door jingled, but it felt mournful, echoing emptiness. The interior was dimly lit, filled with a haze of smoke and the scent of old coffee. A small counter stood at the back, but it was deserted, a single chair tipped over as if someone had left in a hurry. I waited, glancing around nervously, but there were no other drivers in sight. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of trucks through the decades, their proud owners grinning at the camera. I felt like an intruder in their long-gone world, and the silence pressed in on me. The door swung open suddenly, and a man stepped in, the sun's light pouring in behind him like a spotlight. He was older, graying at the temples, a kind smile breaking through the weariness etched on his face. "Hey there," he greeted, his voice warm but tinged with an undercurrent of caution. "You lost?" I hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Just taking a break. Long night on the road." He nodded, eyes scanning the empty room. "You picked a hell of a spot. Not many come here anymore. Most folks prefer the highway," he said, his gaze now fixed on the door. The warmth faded from his expression. "Things aren't what they used to be." Before I could respond, the door swung open again. The man from the parking lot stepped in, his presence darkening the room as the door creaked ominously behind him. The older man tensed, his smile fading into a grim line as their eyes met. "Thought I'd find you here," the newcomer said, his voice low and gravelly, an unsettling calmness wrapping around his words. The older man straightened. "What do you want?" he asked, but it was clear he already knew the answer. The air grew thick with tension, like the moments before a storm. I felt trapped, the walls closing in around me. The younger man shifted, his eyes locking onto me with a predatory glint. "You shouldn't have run," he murmured, every word dripping with malice. Panic surged through me, a primal urge to flee. I glanced at the exit, heart racing as the weight of their stares bore down on me. I needed to escape before the night swallowed me whole, but in that instant, I felt a cold realization settle in. There was no escaping this. I was already ensnared in their game, and I had no idea of the rules. I had not thought much about the night, but it returned to me with startling clarity as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the peeling paint on the wall. Shadows crept along the corners of my small room, mocking me with memories I wished to forget. The air felt heavy, thick with dread. I could still hear the sound of the diesel engine echoing in my ears, a reminder of the truckers who drove through our small town, leaving behind more than just tire tracks. It had been 2 days since I'd seen the driver last. I had tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, but paranoia had a knack for growing roots in the fertile soil of fear. I could trace back my discomfort to that afternoon when I had been at the diner. The familiar smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee had wrapped around me like a warm blanket, but the presence of that driver had chilled me to the bone. He had come in quietly, slipping through the door like a shadow. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a worn-out cap, but I could see the glint of his eyes, sharp and full of something primal. He had sat in the corner booth, and I felt his gaze flicking between the other patrons and me. When he ordered, his voice was gravelly, deep like the ground I had never wanted to dig into. I tried to ignore him as I served the usual crowd, farmers in flannel shirts, tired locals who always sat at the same tables. But there was something about him that gnawed at my insides. I caught him watching me, studying me. I could feel the weight of his eyes, heavy and unyielding. I had hurried to the back, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. For 2 nights, I had wrestled with the thought of him. My mind kept replaying our brief encounter as I lay in bed, a relentless loop that bled into my dreams. I dreamt of a highway stretching to infinity, where trucks barreled through the night like ominous phantoms. I would wake up, my sheets soaked with sweat, the echoes of engines still resonating in my ears. The next night, I decided to confront my fears. I would go back to the diner, face the driver, and show him that I was not afraid. But as I stepped into the diner, a frigid gust of wind followed me in, sending a shiver down my spine. The atmosphere felt different that night, charged and electric, as if everyone was holding their breath. The driver was there again, but this time he was not alone. A small group of men surrounded him, laughter spilling from their lips, throaty and guttural. I retreated to the counter, pouring coffee and pretending to be busy, but I could feel his eyes searching for me, even as I avoided his gaze. I could sense something unsaid hanging in the air, something sinister that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. The waitress, Judy, leaned over the counter and whispered, "You see that guy? He's a troublemaker. Trucker gangs roll through here sometimes, and they're not just passing through." Her voice trembled, and I could see the fear in her eyes. "You don't want to get mixed up with them." I forced a smile, but her warning only deepened the pit of dread in my stomach. I glanced back at the driver, his laughter now sharper, more menacing. I caught bits of their conversation, snippets of talk about roads less traveled and dark places where the sun never shone. The laughter faded, and I could hear the chilling undertone of their words, the kind that sent a jagged piece of ice sliding down my spine. I made my escape, my heart racing as I pushed through the door. The night air was suffocating, and I hurried to my car, hoping to put as much distance between me and that diner as possible. As I drove through the darkened streets, trees loomed like sentinels, and I could not shake the feeling of being followed. It was absurd, but my mind spun tales of what could happen if I didn't get out of there. My phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled over, fumbling to retrieve it, and saw a text from Karen, my best friend. "You okay?" "Heard some talk about the truckers. They're not good news." I scoffed at how she always jumped to conclusions, but deep down, the unease seeped in again. The next day, I decided to stay home. I turned off my phone and ignored the world outside. I settled into a comfortable routine, or so I thought. I cleaned, cooked, and read, all while the unsettling presence of those truckers lingered in the back of my mind. But life has a way of slapping you into reality when you least expect it. That evening, I heard a knock on my door. It was sharp and insistent, a sound that echoed through the empty hallways of my unease. My heart raced as I approached the door, peering through the peephole. I felt a wave of dread wash over me as I spotted the familiar figure, the driver. I stepped back, panic flooding my veins. My instinct screamed at me to run, to hide. I could hear him calling out, his voice low and gravelly, the laugh from the diner rippling in my mind. The door felt like a flimsy barrier against the storm of uncertainty that brewed outside. I glanced around, searching for something, anything that could protect me. Suddenly, my thoughts were cut short by another knock, louder this time. The door rattled, sending a surge of adrenaline through me. I could not let him in. I would not let him in. Then, I heard it. A soft rustling sound, too quiet to be a mere figment of my imagination. It came from the back of the house, somewhere in the dimness of my own space I had thought was sanctuary. Fear gripped my throat as I turned to look, my heart pounding in my ears, the driver's shadow looming larger in my mind as I wrestled with the growing darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. Story 3, Voices Beneath the Cabin Floor. The rain started just as we turned onto the gravel road. I could see the pines loom dark and sharp against the ashen sky, swaying like the fingers of a hand reaching for something lurking just beyond the tree line. It was early October, and the air was thick with the sense of damp earth and decaying leaves. My best friend, Sarah, sat next to me, her excitement palpable despite the gloom hanging over the forest. "I can't believe we're finally doing this," she exclaimed, her voice pitched higher than usual. I glanced at her, a smile tugging at my lips, but an unsettling knot curled in my stomach. There was something about this trip that felt off, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The cabin we were renting belonged to Sarah's uncle, a man I had never met but whose reputation was that of a recluse. Sarah had assured me it was well kept, a cozy getaway, but rumors swirled around it. Locals whispered of strange happenings in those woods, tales of lost hikers and the shadows that hid within the trees. I brushed them aside, telling myself that they were just stories meant to scare children. We parked the old SUV in front of the cabin, a modest structure that seemed to hunch beneath the weight of its surroundings. It was made of weathered wood, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The porch sagged slightly, and the windows appeared dull and lifeless, as if they had not seen a human face in years. "Come on, let's get inside." Sarah tugged on my arm, her enthusiasm infectious, and I followed her up the creaking steps. As we entered, a musty scent greeted us, and I wrinkled my nose. The interior felt darker than it should have, even with the overcast light filtering through the grimy windows. Dust motes danced in the air, and the silence was heavy, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Just like I remembered. Sarah laughed, her voice bouncing off the wooden walls. I forced a grin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trespassers in a place that should have been forgotten. We spent the first hour unpacking and settling in, our laughter ringing hollow in the quiet space. The cabin had a small kitchen, a living area with mismatched furniture, and a staircase leading to 2 bedrooms above. The decor was a mix of rustic charm and unsettling oddities. A mounted deer head watched over us, its glassy eyes seemed to follow my every move. Let's explore, Sarah shouted, her hair swirling as she grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the door. I hesitated, looking back into the dim interior, but the thrill of adventure overcame my apprehension. We stepped outside, the air cool against our skin, and ventured into the woods that hugged the cabin. The trees climbed toward the sky, their towering forms blocking the weak daylight. I felt small and insignificant as we walked deeper into the underbrush, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the occasional rustle of a creature skittering away. I attempted to focus on the beauty of the forest, the colors of autumn whispering promises of warmth, but dread clung to me like the damp air. What do you think is out here? Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Her voice echoed, almost lost among the trees. I shrugged, attempting to sound nonchalant. Probably just animals. You know, deer and stuff, I replied, but I could feel the chill creeping down my spine. We wandered further, eventually stumbling upon a small clearing. It felt like a pocket of air in the dense forest, but something about it made my heart race. The sunlight barely pierced through the canopy, creating a patchy quilt of light and shadow. In the center of the clearing stood a weathered stone well, its opening dark and foreboding. What do you think it is? I asked, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. Maybe it's an old well? Sarah suggested, stepping closer. Curiosity flickered in her eyes, and I wanted to pull her back, to warn her, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I watched as she leaned over, peering into the abyss. Be careful, I called, instinctively moving toward her. I felt a strange pull toward the darkness below, as if something was beckoning me to look. I swallowed hard, shaking my head to clear the fog in my mind. Nothing down there but darkness, Sarah said, straightening up. The grin had faded from her face, replaced by a shadow of doubt. Let's head back, I urged, glancing over my shoulder. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at the sky, and an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. As we retraced our steps, I could sense it, the quiet shift in the atmosphere. The forest felt alive, watching us with unseen eyes. Did you hear that? Sarah's voice broke the silence, her tone slightly panicked. I stopped. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a low rustling that seemed to come from behind us. My heart raced as I scanned the trees, my breath catching. It's probably just a rabbit, I said, forcing a laugh, but my voice was thin. We hurried back to the cabin, the oppressive silence of the woods swallowing any trace of lightheartedness. I locked the door behind us, the sound echoing in the stillness. Sarah sank onto the couch, her hands trembling slightly as she ran them through her hair. What is it? I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. I couldn't tell if my unease was contagious or if the forest had truly gotten under my skin. Just a weird feeling, you know, she replied, looking out the window at the trees, their shapes now twisted and threatening. The air felt heavier, as if the weight of the woods was pressing against the cabin's walls. As night began to creep in, the shadows lengthened and the forest grew more ominous. We settled into silence, the only sound the occasional creak of the owls settling. I tried to focus on the flickering light of the small lantern we had turned on, but my mind kept wandering back to that well. Darkness enveloped the cabin, and as the wind howled outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting in the shadows, waiting for its moment to creep into our lives. I glanced at Sarah, who looked lost in her own thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder what secrets this place held, and if we were truly alone in the woods. The first night at the cabin had been unsettling, but I told myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. The wind howled through the trees, and the owls creaked like a living thing, but I found a fragile comfort in the familiar confines of my childhood refuge. My brother, Derek, had left early that morning to hunt, though he assured me he would return before dark. I was left alone, surrounded by the suffocating embrace of the woods. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a fire in the stone hearth and watched the flames crackle and dance. Shadows flickered across the walls of the cabin, twisting into grotesque forms that played tricks on my eyes. I wrapped my arms around my knees, feeling the chill seep into my bones. The fireplace was supposed to provide warmth, yet I felt an icy grip tightening around me, squeezing my throat and urging me to leave. The phone had been disconnected for years, and my only link to the outside world was the radio, its crackling static echoing my own unease. As I turned it on, I scrolled through the frequencies, searching for something that would anchor my mind. The radio hissed, picking up snippets of a weather report, but soon devolved into a jarring mix of ghostly whispers and static that sent shivers down my spine. I switched it off, the silence that followed pressing heavily on my senses. I had not intended to sleep, but fatigue crept in as I stared into the flames. My eyelids grew heavy, and I surrendered to the pull of sleep, ensconced in the rhythmic crackle of the fire. It felt like only moments passed when the sound of a door creaking open jolted me awake. Heart racing, I sat up, the remnants of an unsettling dream fading like smoke. The fire had dimmed, casting the room into near darkness. "Derek?" I called out, my voice sounding foreign in the quiet. The cabin swallowed my words. I stood and moved toward the door, every sound amplified, the creak of the floor, the rustle of my clothes against my skin. I paused, straining to hear any sign of my brother's return, but the only sound was the wind outside, moaning like a wounded animal. I tried to shake off the growing dread that clung to me like an unwelcome shadow. Perhaps Derek was delayed, or he had lost track of time. I didn't want to think of anything worse. As I turned back to the hearth, a sudden chill swept through the room, extinguishing what little warmth the fire had provided. Goosebumps erupted on my arms. That's when I heard it, a low thud from somewhere outside, followed by a series of deliberate footsteps crunching against the underbrush. My heart thrummed in my chest, its beat a frantic metronome. I tiptoed to the window, peering through the grimy glass. The only view was darkness, thick and impenetrable, but the sound of movement grew louder, a sense of urgency in each step. "Derek?" I called again, the name slipping from my lips like a prayer. There was no answer, only the relentless sound of the wind. Against my better judgment, I opened the door, the hinges groaning in protest. The cold hit me like a wave, and I hesitated on the threshold, the cabin's warm glow behind me a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness ahead. I gripped the wooden frame, my fingers trembling, mind racing with possibilities. Shadows danced among the trees, their shapes indistinct. "Derek!" I shouted, the sound swallowed by the night. The wind howled in response, mocking my fear. I took a step outside, the earth soft beneath my feet, the crunch of leaves echoing in the silence. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, but I felt an inexplicable pull, a need to know what lurked in the shadows. I ventured further, shaking branches brushing against my arms. The world around me was eerily still, as if holding its breath. I strained to listen, hoping for the familiar call of my brother, but the sounds of the forest seemed to swallow everything whole, isolating me in an oppressive void. Then came another thud, closer this time, a heavy sound that resonated deep in my chest. My pulse quickened. I turned, scanning the tree line, when a figure emerged from the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. It was not Derek. The silhouette was tall and gaunt, a twisted mockery of a human shape, features obscured by shadow, yet I felt its gaze piercing through the night directly at me. I stepped backward, the weight of the cabin behind me beckoning, but the figure took a step forward, and I froze, rooted in place. "Who are you?" I shrieked, my voice trembling. It didn't respond. Instead, it raised an arm, pointing toward the woods with a deliberate slowness, a motion charged with something I couldn't name. I turned to follow its gesture, eyes straining against the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the forest, vast and unwelcoming. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I stumbled back toward the cabin, the feeling of being watched pressing heavily upon me. I slammed the door shut, locked it with shaking hands, and leaned against it, the weight of panic crashing over me like a tidal wave. The cabin was small, a refuge I had known since childhood. But tonight, it felt like a prison, its walls looming closer, suffocating me. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, the sound of tread echoing in the stillness. I sank to the floor, wrapping my arms around my knees, waiting for Derek to return. I needed him to come back, to shatter the silence and bring reason to the madness encroaching around me. Outside, the wind howled again, and I felt a stirring in the air, the promise of something terrible lingering just beyond the door. I closed my eyes, wishing for morning, wishing for anything to dispel the darkness that had settled in my soul. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of the cabin, casting thin bars of brightness across the dust-covered floor. I woke up disoriented, the dream I had fading like smoke, leaving behind an unsettling sensation curling in my gut. I could barely recall the details, yet the essence of fear clung to me. An omen, I thought. I swung my legs off the bed, feeling the cool wood beneath my feet, and reluctantly forced myself to get up. The cabin felt smaller than it had the night before, as if the walls were closing in. I was alone, and the silence stretched out like a taut string, beckoning me to break it. I glanced toward the front door, wondering how far the nearest help might be. The answer sent a chill down my spine. I was miles from any semblance of civilization. The thought was suffocating, yet I pushed it aside, deciding that I needed to explore the place. As I stepped outside, the crisp air struck me like a slap. The forest loomed around me, ancient trees standing sentinel, their gnarled roots twisting and curling like skeletal fingers. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of damp earth and decay. My resolve hardened. I would not be a prisoner of my fears. I remembered the strange occurrences from the night before, the whispers in the wind, the fleeting shadows. They seemed more vivid in the daylight, as if the forest itself was alive and watching me. I decided to venture further into the woods, hoping to find something, anything, that would distract me. The underbrush crackled beneath my feet as I pushed deeper, the path becoming less defined with each step. I had no real destination in mind, just an urge to escape the cabin's oppressive atmosphere. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a clearing. It was a small space, encircled by towering pines, their needles carpeting the ground in a thick green layer. In the center stood a crumbling stone well, its mouth gaping like a dark maw. I approached cautiously, peering into its depths. The darkness seemed to swirl and breathe, and for a moment, I thought I heard a low, rhythmic thumping echoing from within. I stepped back, my heart racing. Curiosity battled with fear, but I could not shake the feeling that the well held secrets that might explain the feelings of dread that had seeped into my bones since arriving. I knelt down, my fingers brushing against the jagged stones, feeling their coldness seep into my skin. Against my better judgment, I pulled out my phone, the faint light of the screen illuminating the well's edges. I pointed the camera down, hoping to capture something, perhaps a reflection, or even a glimpse of what lay below. The darkness appeared endless, swallowing the light as I zoomed in. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the images, hoping to see something that would offer me reassurance. But the screen revealed only shadows, nothing tangible. Frustrated, I lowered my phone and stood up, brushing dirt from my knees. A rustle in the bushes snapped my attention. I turned sharply, scanning the tree line. Perhaps it was just a deer, I told myself, or maybe a bird. But the forest was too still. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run back to the cabin, but something anchored me to the spot, a morbid curiosity tugging at my mind. Then I saw it, a fleeting movement, like a shadow crossing my vision. I blinked, and it was gone. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and the air felt charged, electric. I began to back away, each step deliberate, as if the forest itself were alive, disapproving of my presence. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, crunching on twigs and leaves. Heart racing, I spun around, prepared to confront whatever had been stalking me. But the clearing was empty. I stood frozen, the oppressive silence returning, thicker than before. It felt as though the woods held its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned and dashed back toward the cabin, adrenaline surging through me. Each snap of a twig felt like a footfall behind me, urging me to run faster. The trees seemed to close in as I navigated the narrow path, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The cabin emerged from the underbrush like a fortress, and I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding. I was safe, I told myself, but the creeping fear was unyielding. I hurried to check the windows, the locks, making sure I was secure in this rickety structure. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. I needed to keep busy, to distract myself from the heavy weight of fear that clung to my mind. I rummaged through the cabin, searching for anything that could occupy my thoughts. Dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with old books and forgotten trinkets. One book caught my attention, a worn leather-bound journal that lay hidden behind a stack of faded photographs. I pulled it out, the cover cracked and fragile. I opened it, revealing pages filled with spidery handwriting, the ink faded but legible. As I read, the world outside faded away. The journal belonged to someone named Nathaniel, who had spent countless days here, documenting moments of solitude, a yearning for peace in the woods. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. Nathaniel's words darkened, filled with paranoia and dread, speaking of whispers in the wind and shadows lurking just beyond the trees. My pulse quickened with each line. He wrote of seeing figures moving at the edge of his vision, always just out of reach, and how he could hear them calling his name in a language he could not understand. The final entry was hastily scrawled, the ink running down the page as if he had written it in a frenzy. It warned against venturing too deep into the woods, claiming that the well was a gateway, a threshold to something unspeakable. I shut the journal with trembling hands, my heart racing. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and the shadows of the trees stretched longer and darker. I felt their presence pressing in on me, a weight of foreboding. Nathaniel's words echoed in my mind, wrapping around me like a noose. I was now alone, and whatever had taken hold of this place had no intention of letting me go. The following days bled into one another, each sunrise a reluctant promise of more unease. I had ventured deeper into the woods, consumed by a primal curiosity that warred against the instinct to flee. The air felt charged, heavy, as if the trees themselves held their breath, waiting. The shadows grew longer each afternoon, stretching out like sinister fingers reaching for my soul. I could sense something lurking beyond the edges of my vision, a presence that flitted just out of reach. I had returned to the cabin, my refuge and my prison. The walls loomed around me, the corners too dark, the silence too loud. I spent my days scavenging for supplies, gathering what little I could find to sustain myself. The pantry, once stocked with canned goods, now teetered on the brink of emptiness. As I rummaged through the remnants of someone else's life, I could almost hear their laughter echoing in the empty rooms, a haunting reminder of normalcy I could scarcely comprehend. It was on the third night that I first heard the whispers. They curled around me, serpentine and soft, slithering through the cracks in the cabin's walls. I had just extinguished the dying fire, its orange glow fading into a cold blue shadow, when the sound emerged. I thought I might have imagined it at first, the low murmur that pulsed with a life of its own. Yet as I lay in the stillness, that sound wormed its way into my mind, growing louder, more distinct. The words were alien, a foreign tongue that twisted and turned, taunting me. I sat up, my heart pounding, mind racing. The floor creaked beneath me as I moved, a reluctant footfall toward the source of the sound. It seemed to come from the corner of the main room, where the walls had begun to swell and warp. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to catch the words, but they slipped away as quickly as they came. The temperature plummeted, and I shivered, my breath clouding in the dim light. I stumbled backward, slamming against the table, sending a glass jar clattering to the floor. It shattered, a cacophony of sharp sounds slicing through the silence. The whispers shifted, then stopped, leaving only the quiet creaking of the cabin around me. In that moment, a cold dread settled in my chest. I was not alone. The next day, I ventured out into the thicket, desperate for distraction. The forest felt alive, each rustle and snap echoing my unease. I followed a narrow trail that wound deeper into the woods, each step heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. I turned back frequently, convinced I would find something, an animal, a figure flitting between the trees. But only shadows met my gaze. I stumbled upon a clearing, a long-abandoned campsite, the remnants of a fire pit surrounded by decaying logs. A sense of desolation enveloped me. As I picked through the debris, I uncovered a tattered map, its edges frayed and worn. The ink had faded, but I could make out markings, symbols I didn't recognize, a scrawl in the margins that warned of the hollow. A chill crept down my spine. The whispers in the cabin echoed in my mind, and I wondered if they had come from this place. With the setting sun looming in the distance, I knew I had to return to the cabin. The light slipped away too quickly, and shadows crept in like a tide, threatening to drown the last remnants of safety. As I retraced my steps, a rustle in the underbrush caught my attention. I froze, holding my breath. A figure emerged, barely visible between the trees. I squinted, heart racing. It was a woman, her hair tangled like weeds, her dress torn and filthy. "Help me," she rasped, voice like gravel. "Please." I took a cautious step forward, but she recoiled, eyes wide with fear. "No, don't. They'll see you." "Who?" I managed to whisper, the words like ash in my mouth. "The ones in the woods," she said, her gaze darting back into the shadows. "They're watching." "Are you alone?" I asked, desperate for connection. "Never alone," she replied. "They're always with me." A shiver ran through me. I could feel the weight of her gaze, and I knew I had to get away. I turned and ran, the forest flashing past me, branches clawing at my arms. I reached the cabin, slamming the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around me like a storm. I tried to drown them out, covering my ears, but they penetrated my thoughts, merging into one incessant refrain: "You shouldn't have come here." I knelt by the fireplace, clutching the map I had found. My heart raced as I traced the erratic lines with my finger, searching for meaning in the chaos. The symbols seemed to wriggle under my touch, alive and mocking. It felt as though the cabin itself pulsed around me, a living entity, and the whispers grew more insistent. I wanted to scream, to cry out against the darkness encroaching on my sanity. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had become a blurry concept. I could no longer distinguish between reality and the fleeting shadows in my mind. The walls seemed to close in, squeezing the air from my lungs. I snatched a candle from the table, its wick barely surviving, and lit it with shaking hands. The flame flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced across the walls like taunting phantoms. I felt the weight of the night pressing against the cabin, threatening to swallow me whole. The whispers crescendoed, a chaotic symphony of despair. I stumbled to the window, peering out into the dark expanse. The forest loomed like a sentient being, branches twisting and curling as if reaching toward me. I stepped back, heart pounding in my ears, desperate for escape. I had to leave, but as I turned toward the door, I knew it was a trap. Whatever had taken root in these woods would not let me go. Outside, the darkness waited, breathing, watching. And within, the cabin trembled, its very essence alive with a hunger I could no longer deny. The night came too soon, draping the cabin in an oppressive cloak of darkness. The last light of day faded behind the thick trees that surrounded our little sanctuary. I could still hear the echoes of laughter from earlier, when Jess had managed to coax a smile out of me. We had joked about the creaky floorboards and the musty smell that lurked in every corner, but that mirth felt like a distant memory now. As the sun disappeared completely, a chill seeped into the cabin, penetrating even the thickest blankets we had piled on the couch. Jess claimed she was only going to grab some firewood, but as the minutes ticked by, her absence became a gnawing worry in my gut. I stood and walked to the window, peering into the inky blackness outside. The trees loomed like skeletal hands, gnarled and menacing against the starless sky. "Jess!" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. I strained my ears, listening for the sound of her footsteps crunching the dried leaves, or the snap of a twig underfoot, but there was only silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed alive, pressing against me as if the woods themselves wanted to swallow me whole. Panic began to creep in, wrapping its icy fingers around my heart. I had no idea how long she'd been gone. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was past 8. She should have been back by now. I took a deep breath, trying to quell the rising tide of dread. I grabbed a flashlight from the cluttered shelf and stepped outside, every nerve in my body screaming with unease. The air was colder than I expected, biting against my skin as I walked into the woods. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of the ground and revealing the twisted roots that seemed to reach for me, eager to trip me up. "Jess!" I called again, heart racing, feeling foolish with each shout that echoed back to me, swallowed by the night. I knew this forest well enough to find my way around, but the shadows shifted, and the trees felt like they were closing in on me. The silence turned palpable, and I could almost hear my own heartbeat as I pressed deeper into the woods. Every glance over my shoulder made me feel like I was being watched, a lurking presence hiding just out of sight. Then, a sound pierced the silence, a soft rustling, followed by a startled gasp. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. "Jess!" I whispered, praying that it was her. The rustling repeated, more frantic this time. I turned the flashlight toward the source, revealing a thicket of bushes swaying gently. My heart raced as I stepped closer, the beam shaking in my hands. "Jess!" I called once more, louder this time. The rustling stopped, and an eerie stillness fell over the scene. I pushed through the underbrush, determined to find her. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows against the trees. "Jess! Are you there?" It felt like a graveyard of silence, and dread pulled in my stomach. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a tree, and I stumbled back, almost dropping the flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I struggled to recognize the familiar features. It was not Jess, but a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes that glinted with something I couldn't quite place. He wore ragged clothing, as if he had stumbled out of the very depths of this forest. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. My instinct screamed at me to run, but curiosity held me rooted to the spot. "Looking for your friend, are you?" he asked, a sardonic smile cracking his parched lips. "You shouldn't be out here alone. The woods aren't safe at night. Where's Jess?" I asked, my voice stronger now, though I felt a tremor in my knees. "What do you know about her?" "Depends," he said, tilting his head like a curious animal. "What will you give me if I tell you?" I edged back, the hairs on the back of my neck standing upright. "I don't want to play games. Just tell me where she is." The man chuckled, a low, gravelly sound that reverberated through the trees. "You're in no position to make demands, kid. She's deeper in the woods, where the shadows know her name." "Take me to her," I said, desperation clawing at my throat. "I'm not afraid of you." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing, and I felt a chill wash over me that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Fear is a tool, boy. You should learn to respect it." He gestured deeper into the forest, where darkness thickened like fog. "You might find her there, or you might find something else altogether." I hesitated, a war raging inside me. But Jess was out here, and I couldn't leave her behind. I took a step forward, and the man's smile widened. "Good choice. Follow me then, if you dare." He turned, moving deeper into the woods with swift, fluid movements. I trailed behind, the beam of my flashlight quivering against the oppressive shadows. Each step felt like an entry into a labyrinth, every rustle and whisper of the wind amplifying the fear gnawing at my insides. As we moved further into the heart of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were watching us, their twisted branches reaching like gnarled fingers. And with every step I took, I could feel the pull of something ancient and sinister lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to succumb to its grasp. Story 4: Echoes of the Forgotten Cell Block. The clanging of the iron gate echoed like a funeral bell as I stepped into the yard. Sunlight poured down in harsh beams, illuminating the cracked concrete that had been subjected to years of neglect. I had been here a year, but the stench of despair and sweat still hit me like a brick wall. I was about to say goodbye to my old life, a life defined by mistakes, a life I could barely remember. Instead, I had traded it for the bleak existence of a maximum security prison. Around me, inmates lounged like lions waiting for the right moment to pounce. Some played cards, while others leaned against the walls, their hardened eyes scanning the yard for weakness. I had learned to stay under the radar, to blend in, but blending in was harder than it sounded. Every glance felt like a knife, every whisper a threat waiting to unravel the fragile peace I had built in this hellhole. I had spent most of my time in solitary confinement. It had been a punishment, of course, but for me, it had become a sanctuary. The constant hum of the outside world faded away, leaving only my thoughts echoing in the dark. I had come to learn that, in a place like this, it wasn't the walls that confined you but the shadows of your past. I couldn't escape mine, no matter how hard I tried. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows that danced across the yard. I felt an itch in my gut, a warning that something was off today. Perhaps it was the way the guards were moving, more alert, more agitated. Or maybe it was the tension hanging thick in the air, like the calm before a storm. I turned to head back toward my cell when I heard a scuffle behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. Two men squared off near the far wall, their shouts mixing with the sounds of the yard. It was a common occurrence, yet today felt different. The tension had a palpable weight, and I could sense that the other inmates were as wary as I was. I took a step back, moving toward the shadows, hoping to avoid the clash. But curiosity pulled me closer. The two men were locked in a fierce struggle, fists flying and veins bulging. One of them, a shoulder tattooed with the visage of a Grim Reaper, threw a punch that landed with a sickening thud. The other man stumbled back, rage transforming into desperation. It was a classic fight, a display of raw power and anger that meant nothing in the grand scheme of our lives. Still, I felt the urge to get involved, but I also knew that getting involved meant getting caught in whatever chaos ensued. Then, a loud crack echoed across the yard, a sound that shattered the air. Instinctively, I ducked, my heart racing. The guards began to shout, their voices blending with the chaos as they rushed toward the fight. In a matter of seconds, the yard erupted into a frenzy. Inmates scattered like ants, some seeking shelter, others clamoring to get a view of the unfolding drama. I took cover behind a concrete pillar, my back pressed against the rough surface. My breath came in short gasps as I watched the guards draw their batons, faces twisted in anger and fear. It was then that I caught a glimpse of something that sent a chill down my spine, a glint of metal tucked into the waistband of the Grim Reaper tattooed inmate. A shank! Panic surged within me, the realization that this was no ordinary fight. Someone was going to die. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I could disappear. I thought of the solitary confinement cell, its suffocating walls that felt safer than the madness around me. But there was no escape from this. The thrill of violence crackled in the air, and I could taste the adrenaline on my tongue. I knew I had to decide, stay hidden or make a run for it. As the guards struggled to contain the chaos, the tattooed man lunged forward, the blade glistening under the waning light. I could see the fear in the eyes of his opponent, who stumbled backward, hands raised in a futile plea for mercy. I had to look away. I couldn't bear to witness the bloodshed, but the primal urge to watch was powerful. That's when I heard a scream shatter the night. It pierced through the chaos, drawing my attention back like a moth to a flame. The inmates had formed a circle, and I could see two figures wrestling on the ground, flailing limbs and desperate gasps filling the air. The tattooed man had gained the upper hand, pinning his opponent down. I clutched my hands into fists, feeling the remnants of my own anger bubbling to the surface. Did I have the guts to intervene? Before I could think, the guards finally broke through the throng of inmates, their batons raised like swords of justice. I felt a morbid sense of satisfaction wash over me as they rushed toward the chaos. But as they reached the two men, the tattooed inmate lashed out, a wild swing that sent one guard reeling back into the crowd. It was then that everything escalated. The guards shouted orders, but their voices were drowned out by the howls of rage and desperation. I watched in horror as the blade found its mark, a scream erupting from the pinned man. Time slowed, and I could see the fear in his eyes, a reflection of my own fears. The scene spiraled into a nightmare, and I could no longer stand by. I slipped back into the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. The world around me blurred as I ran, not knowing where I was headed, but desperate to escape the violence that hung in the air like a thick fog. In the depths of this prison, survival was the only truth, and I was determined to cling to it, even as the darkness threatened to consume us all. The cell block loomed above me, shadows clinging to its cracked walls like the memories of the men who had passed through its narrow halls. It was a place that swallowed hope and exhaled despair, a sanctuary for those who had forgotten the world outside. I had spent 2 weeks inside these walls, and while the steel bars had initially felt like a cage, it was the darkness lurking beyond them that began to gnaw at my sanity. I had settled into a rhythm, if it could be called that. Meals were sparse, the food tasteless and devoid of any resemblance to nourishment. The guards patrolled with an air of indifference, their laughter echoing through the halls as they mocked the prisoners like we were less than human. I kept my head down, my mouth shut, and my thoughts to myself, knowing that anything else would only invite trouble. But trouble had a way of finding you. I noticed something odd about my cellmate, Carter. He had arrived a few days after me, a wiry man with haunted eyes that darted around the room as if he were constantly seeking an escape. Though he never spoke much, I caught glimpses of his nightmares in the way he flinched at sudden sounds and gasped in the dead of night. I had initially thought it was the stress of incarceration, but I learned quickly that there was more to his fear, a darkness he carried that gnawed at him from within. Each night, as the fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed overhead, I could feel the weight of the prison pressing down, the walls seemingly closing in on us. Carter would often sit up in the middle of the night, his breath hitching as he stared into the shadows that danced against our cell wall. I wanted to comfort him, to ask what haunted him so, but fear tethered my tongue, and I opted instead to feign sleep, my heart racing in sync with his panicked breaths. One evening, after a day spent listening to the distant echoes of men shouting from the yard, I crawled into my cot, hoping for some respite. Just as I began to drift, a shrill scream pierced the night, echoing through the block like a siren. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear guards running, their shouts ringing out, but the piercing scream continued, followed by a guttural wail that sent chills down my spine. What the hell was that? I whispered, glancing at Carter, who sat at the edge of his cot, eyes wide and unblinking. Chambers, he muttered, as if the name itself was a curse. They say he lost it. Went crazy. Couldn't take it anymore. Who's Chambers? But my question faded into the oppressive silence, unanswered. The screams had subsided, replaced by a haunting stillness that seemed to settle like fog over the block. I lay back down, anxiety coiling tightly around my chest, and despite myself, I could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The following morning, the atmosphere felt different. The guards were on edge, their eyes flickering nervously as they exchanged whispers. Breakfast was a dismal affair, and as I pushed the unappetizing slop around my plate, I caught Carter staring blankly at the wall. When our eyes met, I saw something shift in him, a flicker of understanding, as if he had uncovered a truth that had eluded me. What happened last night? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He swallowed hard, his throat working as if he were choking on the words. Chambers, he tried to escape. They caught him, but not before. His words trailed off, and he looked away, lost in the dark corners of his mind. I leaned closer. What did he do? Something terrible. They say he saw the shadows, heard them whispering. He thought they were calling him. His voice trembled, and I could feel the dread filling the tiny space between us. Later that morning, the guards rounded us up for a head count, and I waited in line, the concrete floor cold beneath my feet. As I stood there, I saw the thick steel door to the isolation cell, stark and forbidding, just down the hall. Chambers had been taken there, I was certain. The isolation cells were infamous, a punishment meted out to men who stepped out of line or lost their grip on reality. When my turn came, the guard's eyes bore into me, scanning my face as if I held the answers to questions he dared not ask. I felt exposed and vulnerable, a sensation that made my skin crawl. But I held his gaze, refusing to give in to the fear that threatened to consume me. Later, in the yard, I found myself watching the shadows stretch across the concrete, the sun casting long fingers that seemed to beckon me deeper into the darkness. I spotted Carter pacing, his agitation evident as he looked over his shoulder, as if he feared something was lurking just out of sight. Why don't you tell me what you know? I urged, stepping closer. I can't, he said, shaking his head vehemently. You don't understand. They're always there, watching. They want you to see them. Who? The ones who don't escape, he whispered, his eyes darting around the yard. The ones who get taken to the dark places. A chill worked its way down my spine as I considered his words. Night fell slowly over the prison, and as I returned to my cell, I could feel the oppressive weight of dread clinging to me. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant murmurs of the men around me, but all I could think about were the shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe with life of their own. Carter's frightened whispers haunted me, turning the very air in the cell into a suffocating blanket. I closed my eyes, but sleep eluded me, and the shadows began to creep closer, hungry and insistent. I realized with a sinking feeling that I was not safe here, not from the prison, and not from whatever lingered in the corners of my mind. The hollow echoes of the prison's damp stone walls haunted my every step as I navigated the narrow, dimly lit corridor. I could feel the weight of the air pressing against my chest, thick with the scent of decay and despair. The night shift guards moved like shadows, their presence a constant reminder of the bars that confined us all, but it was the whispers that kept me awake. They slithered through the cracks of the building, carrying tales of men who had lost their minds within these walls. 2 nights had passed since I found the first note tucked beneath my mattress. The paper, yellowed and frayed, bore a simple message: "They're watching you." At first, I had dismissed it as a prank, perhaps a joke from the inmates who reveled in tormenting the new arrivals. But as each hour dragged on, amplified by the shrieks of the unhinged, the weight of those words morphed into something sinister, clawing at the edges of my sanity. I had tried to find comfort in the small community of cellmates I shared my confinement with, but we were just as trapped by our own secrets as we were by the iron bars. There was Munoz, a man whose constant chattering belied darkness hidden beneath his jovial facade. He claimed to be in for a petty theft, but as he spoke of his misunderstood past, I saw the glint of something more dangerous in his eyes. Then there was Caldwell, who spent his days painting morose landscapes on scraps of paper. His silence was far more unnerving than Munoz's incessant banter. He seemed to know things he wasn't willing to share. That night, I sat on the edge of my cot, the rusting springs creaking beneath me as I stared through the narrow cell window into the oppressive darkness beyond. The moonlight barely illuminated the yard outside, but every flicker of movement sent my heart racing. I had taken to sleeping with the notes crumpled in my hand, convinced that the more tangible the threat, the more I could control it. Each night, I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me, studying, judging, waiting for the moment I would crack. Just as I began to drift into a restless sleep, a shout rang through the corridor, piercing the silence like a knife. Instinctively, I bolted upright, adrenaline flooding my veins. The sound came from the far end of the hall, the kind of desperate cry that could only belong to someone who had lost their grip on reality. I strained to hear more, but the clamor of boots against concrete drowned out everything else. Moments later, I heard the heavy clang of a cell door slamming shut and the muffled voices of guards. I wished I could be like Munoz, who could always spin a tale out of any situation, but my mind raced with dark possibilities. What if they had found out about the notes? What if they had turned their scrutiny toward me? "Hey, you awake?" Munoz whispered, his voice low and shaky. I turned to see him peering through the bars of our adjoining cells. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, sounded like someone was losing it." "It's probably just Caldwell again," he said, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. But I wasn't so sure. Caldwell was odd but not violent, at least, not in the way his cry had suggested. I decided to keep my mouth shut about the notes as I looked at Munoz. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear, and for the first time, I couldn't tell if he was putting on an act or genuinely terrified. Whatever was happening outside our cells felt malignant, a festering wound that had finally burst. The sounds of boots grew closer, and I pressed my ear against the cold steel of my cell door. "Maybe we should just keep quiet," I suggested, but my voice trembled as I spoke. Munoz's eyes darted to the shadows, and suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the corridor, followed by frantic shouts. I felt my stomach twist. Whatever was unfolding out there was spiraling into chaos. Without thinking, I grabbed a crumpled note from my bed and pressed it against my chest. The words felt like a mantra now. "They're watching you." I turned to Munoz. "We need to find out what's going on." "Are you crazy?" he hissed, his voice barely audible over the commotion. "You want to get us killed?" Before I could respond, the corridor lit up, fluorescent lights flickering to life, casting an unsettling glow that made the shadows dance wildly. I squinted against the harsh brightness, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift, a figure moving with unnatural speed further down the hall. "Look," I whispered, pointing toward the movement. Munoz followed my gaze but didn't seem to see anything. "Just a guard," he said, but I could hear the quaver in his voice. The figure moved between the bars of the cells, almost gliding, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. It wasn't a guard. It was a body, pale and gaunt, and it was approaching us. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, but something compelled me to remain. The figure drew closer, the fluorescent lights revealing more details. A face, twisted and familiar. Caldwell. His eyes had lost their clarity, replaced by a hollow gaze that seemed to absorb the light around him. "Help," he rasped, and I could hardly recognize his voice. "They're coming for you." The words blurred into my mind, and I barely caught the sobering realization that the whispers in the night were not mere echoes of fear. They were warnings. The walls of this prison had eyes, ears, and perhaps even a will of their own. Caldwell reached for the bars, his trembling hands brushing against them, leaving a streak of something dark and red. It was then I knew the horror was not just in our confinement, but in what the confines of these walls had birthed. My heart raced. My choice was clear. I would have to confront what lay beyond the shadows, for it was watching me, and I was running out of time. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the concrete yard of Stonehill Correctional Facility. I stood by the chain-link fence, the weight of the day settling into my bones like a forgotten burden. The howling winds whispered secrets, and the distant clang of metal echoed through the air, punctuating the heavy silence that surrounded us. Days blurred into one another in this place, yet the memory of what had transpired within these walls haunted me more than ever. It had been 2 weeks since I had found the note tucked beneath my mattress. The scribbled words, "They know what you did. Watch your back," felt like a dark omen, tightening the knot of dread in my gut. I tried to dismiss it as another inmate's sick joke, but the unease gnawed at me, especially after last week's incident. I could still feel the cold grip of terror that had claimed the yard that day when Curtis, the man with the razor-sharp tongue and eyes that glinted with malice, had been dragged away screaming. He had been found lifeless in the shower, a gash across his throat that none of us spoke about, but we all felt it. The air grew thicker, and every glance felt like a prelude to violence. That night, a whispering wind carried rumors from cell to cell. They said Curtis had been a snitch, that his blood was the price for betrayal. They said it could happen to any of us, especially those of us who had something to hide. The weight of my own past loomed over me, an unshakable shadow in this hellish place. As dusk settled, I trudged back to my cell, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the echoes of the facility. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow that felt less like illumination and more like a warning. I passed by the common area, where a few inmates hunched over worn tables, their faces obscured by the dim light. They looked up as I walked past, and I felt their eyes bore into me, scrutinizing and assessing, as if they could peel back my layers and reveal the secrets I so desperately tried to conceal. Inside my cell, the air was stale, thick with the smell of sweat and despair. I dropped onto my cot and reached beneath the mattress, fingers brushing against the crumpled paper. My heart raced as I unfolded the note again, the jagged handwriting clawing at my mind. There was something about it that unsettled me, a feeling that it hadn't just been a warning but a portent of something far more sinister. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the mundane life behind bars, but nightmares crept in as sleep overtook me. I dreamt of blood, my blood, pooling around my feet as I stood in the shower, the sound of laughter echoing off the tiles. I woke with a start, gasping for air, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming or if I had slipped into some other reality. The shadows in my cell shifted, and I could swear I felt a presence lingering just beyond the edge of light. A week had passed since the dream, and with it, the atmosphere in Stonehill had grown dark and oppressive. The guards seemed more on edge, their glares more piercing. The murmurs in the common area turned into hushed conversations as I passed, the whispers clinging to me like a shroud. I could feel eyes on me, lurking in the corners, waiting for a moment of weakness. When I finally bumped into Thompson, a wiry man with sharp features and an unsettling grin, I braced myself. He had a reputation for knowing too much, and I had always kept my distance. "You look lost, friend," he said, his voice smooth, almost inviting. "You've been keeping to yourself." "I hear things." It was a feeble attempt at intimidation, but it struck a chord. I felt the instinct to either fight or flee, but my feet were rooted to the ground. "I'm not looking for trouble," I muttered, hoping my tone would dissuade him. "Trouble finds you, whether you want it or not," he replied, his smile widening like a crescent moon. "You should watch your back, they say the walls have ears." As he walked away, I felt a chill creep up my spine, not from fear of Thompson but from the growing realization that I was being hunted, that the note had not been merely a threat, but a warning. The specter of Curtis loomed over me, and I could almost hear the rustle of his ghostly presence behind me. That same night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through the possibilities of what lay in wait. Every creak of the building felt amplified, the sounds of the night exaggerated by my anxiety. I thought of my past, the choices that had led me here, memories tainted by regret. The life I had discarded before finding myself in prison felt like a distant dream, one that hung over me like a noose waiting to tighten. As days passed, I felt the walls closing in, and the whispers grew louder. I avoided the common area, slipping into the shadows of the prison, staying invisible. I sought refuge in the library, hoping to lose myself within the pages of forgotten novels, but even the words felt like taunts, reminding me of my entrapment. Then, one fateful afternoon, an unexpected noise shattered the mundane routine. A commotion erupted from the yard, and I rushed to the barred window, peering out. Inmates were gathered, their faces pallid with fear, eyes wide, pointing towards the source of the chaos. Someone had fallen, or perhaps been pushed. I felt the blood drain from my face as I recognized a figure crumpled on the ground. A guard lay motionless, blood seeping from a wound on his head. Panic surged through the crowd. I stumbled back from the window, heart pounding, the realization washing over me that this was no accident. It was a message. The prison was turning on itself, and I was caught in the crossfire. The note suddenly made sense. It wasn't just a warning directed at me, but a warning for us all, a portent of the merciless chaos that had taken root behind these walls. I had to survive. I had to find out who was pulling the strings before I became the next victim. The silence that had once felt comforting now felt like the calm before the storm, and I braced myself for whatever horror awaited me next. The low hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above me as I sat on the edge of my cot, the thin mattress sagging beneath my weight. Shadows danced on the cracked cinder block walls, playing tricks on my mind as I thought about the days that had slipped through my fingers like sand. Prison had a way of distorting time, stretching each hour into a painful eternity. The steady ticking of the wall clock matched the tempo of my racing thoughts. The last time I had seen daylight felt like a lifetime ago, and the bitter taste of desperation soured in my mouth. I shifted my gaze to the barred window, the faint outline of the sun barely making it through the grime. The air was stale, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and something metallic that I could never quite identify. It clung to my skin, an invisible reminder of the living nightmare I found myself in. The walls echoed with the distant shouts of other inmates, the clattering of trays during meals, and the sudden bursts of laughter that felt foreign to my ears. Today was different. A chill had swept through the facility, one that even the strongest heaters could not dispel. I could sense the change, a foreboding weight in the atmosphere. It was more than just a cold creeping in. A story was winding its way through the prison, one whispered behind closed doors and down the narrow hallways. I had caught bits of conversations, fragments of fear shared between inmates, but it was when I overheard Daniel, a seasoned inmate with deep-set eyes and a voice that rumbled like thunder, that my stomach twisted in knots. "There's a ghost in the East Wing," he had said, his voice low but clear. "They say he walks the halls at night. At first, it's just the sound of chains, then you see him." I had dismissed it initially, telling myself it was another trick of boredom, another way to scare the newcomers. But as night fell, the tales crept into my mind like a thief in the night, stealing my resolve. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night, metal scraping against metal, the distant whine of a door creaking. I was on edge, my heart hammering against my rib cage like a caged bird desperate to escape. I could almost hear the chains, their soft clinking echoing through the corridor, wrapping around my thoughts. As the clock ticked deeper into the night, I decided enough was enough. Curiosity and fear battled for control, and I found myself rising from the cot, the creak of the mattress sounding like a warning. My feet felt heavy against the cold concrete floor as I made my way towards the door. I reached for the handle, hesitated, and then turned it slowly, the metal cold in my grasp. The corridor was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting erratic shadows that leaped and crawled along the walls. I stepped out into the hall, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Everything was amplified, the echo of my footfalls, the sharp intake of breath, and the rustle of my prison uniform. My heartbeat pulsed in my ears, drowning out the jumbled sounds of distant voices. I walked cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the worn linoleum floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching me from the darkness. I turned left towards the east wing, each step filling me with dread. As I approached the entrance, I could feel the temperature drop even further, an unnatural chill that prickled my skin. The door to the east wing creaked open under my touch, revealing a narrow corridor lined with empty cells. They stood like tombs, silent and foreboding. I hesitated, scanning the darkened area for any signs of movement. It was too quiet, and the silence was suffocating. I felt the urge to turn back, but something compelled me forward, a mix of dread and fascination. A sudden sound pierced the silence, a low, mournful wail that sent shivers down my spine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound echoed through the corridor, reverberating off the walls like a ghostly call. I stepped back, my instinct screaming at me to leave, but then I heard it again. It was closer this time, almost as if it were right behind me. I turned, heart racing, and saw nothing but the darkened hallway. Panic gripped me. My mind raced with thoughts of what could lie ahead. The stories flooded back, tales of those who had vanished, swallowed by the very walls that contained us. I took a step back, ready to retreat, when I caught a glimpse of movement at the far end of the corridor. A figure emerged from the shadows, gaunt and ethereal, standing just beyond the reach of the flickering light. Chains clinked softly as it moved, the sound as haunting as the wails that had filled the air moments before. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I stood transfixed as the figure drew closer, a face half hidden in darkness, its eyes glimmering like stars lost in the void. Fear rooted me to the spot. My heart felt as though it would burst from my chest as the apparition raised a hand, fingers outstretched. An unearthly chill enveloped me, paralyzing my senses. The figure seemed to sway, caught in a dance between realms, and all I could do was watch as it inched closer. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure faded into the shadows, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness. The corridor closed in around me, and I turned on my heel, sprinting back down the hall, each footfall fueled by sheer terror. I stumbled into my cell, slamming the door behind me, panting as I pressed my back against it. The stories whispered through the walls, now more real than ever. There was something in this prison, something that fed on fear, on the darkness that dwelled within each of us. My heart raced, and I knew then that I was not alone, not in this place where nightmares unfurled and shadows took shape. I had to find a way out. Story 5, Echoes of the Forgotten Grove. The town of Eldermore had always been a place of whispers, secrets trailing like the mist that snaked through the trees surrounding it. I had lived there my entire life, my roots entwined with the soil that cradled the twisted oaks and gnarled pines. As a child, I had often played near the edge of the forest, a place both alluring and terrifying, where the light filtered through the branches in patterns that danced like specters. Rumors of the woods were as old as the town itself, tales of lost souls and vengeful spirits woven into the fabric of its history. "Stay away from the forest after dark," my mother would say, her eyes wide with an urgency that sent chills down my spine. I had nodded obediently, the stories of those who vanished into the underbrush lingering in my mind, their fates sealed in that eerie silence. But as I grew older, the curiosity clawed at me, a gnawing desire to know what lay beyond the threshold of familiar trees. That summer, the air was thick with a warmth that felt almost oppressive as it draped over the town. I felt a pull towards the forest, a magnetic force that seemed to beckon me deeper into its embrace. I decided to take a solitary walk one afternoon, convincing myself that it would only be a quick venture to quench my curiosity. I slipped between the shadowy trunks, the sounds of eldermore fading into the background. The forest was alive, yet eerily quiet. The faint rustle of leaves seemed to whisper my name, while the dappled sunlight created an otherworldly ambience. I wandered further in, following a narrow path that twisted like a serpent, each step echoing with the weight of unspoken warnings. I imagined what it must have looked like centuries ago, when the locals had feared the woods enough to avoid them altogether. Time lost meaning as I lost myself in the beauty of the moment. But as I ventured deeper, the light began to fade, and the trees closed in around me. A chill crawled up my spine, and the laughter of children playing in the distance became just a memory. I turned to retrace my steps, but the path felt different. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching toward me like skeletal hands. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft sobbing that sliced through the forest's silence. My heart raced, a primal instinct urging me to flee, yet an inexplicable need to investigate rooted me in place. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down, thickening with an unnameable dread. "Hello?" I called out, my own voice sounding foreign in the stillness. The sobbing paused, and a silence so heavy enveloped me, it felt as though the very forest had drawn a breath. I took a tentative step forward, drawn by the sorrowful sound. The underbrush crackled beneath my feet, each noise amplified in the tense quiet. The sobbing resumed, a pitiful, heart-wrenching sound that beckoned me. I pushed through a thicket, my hands scraping against the rough bark of the trees, until I found her, a girl, maybe 10 years old, huddled beneath a great oak whose roots twisted like ancient serpents. "Are you okay?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She looked up, and the moment our eyes met, a shiver shot through me. Her eyes were hollow, like sunken wells, and her face was as pale as moonlight. "I can't find my way home," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm lost." An inexplicable sadness washed over me, and I wanted to reach out, to comfort her. But something in her gaze held me captive, a fear that gnawed at the edges of my composure. "Where are your parents?" I pressed gently. "I don't know," she replied, her expression slipping into one of helplessness. "I just wanted to play." The memory of my mother's warnings flooded back. I could feel the air growing heavier with each breath. "You shouldn't be here. It's dangerous. Please help me." Her voice was so small, so fragile, it tore at something deep within me. But then, I noticed the way the shadows around her seemed to stretch and breathe, the branches above swaying without wind. I hesitated, torn between the urge to help and the instinct to flee. "We need to get out of here." As I stood, she clutched my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Together, we moved cautiously through the forest, but the path seemed to shift beneath our feet. The trees twisted, contorted, and suddenly, the air was thick with a sense of being watched. I glanced back at her, but her expression had changed, a vacant stare that filled me with dread. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, panic rising as the forest closed in around us, becoming an entity of its own. "To play," she said, her voice eerily calm. My heart thundered as I realized I was no longer guiding her. The girl was pulling me deeper into the woods, and with every step, the the fabric of reality began to unravel. The whispers of the forest intensified, enveloping us in a cacophony of voices that spoke of dark secrets and ancient horrors. That was the moment I knew I was not just lost in the forest. I was ensnared in a web spun by something far more sinister than mere legends. And as the trees closed in around me, I understood that escape from Eldermore's haunted embrace might not be possible. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and twilight draped itself over the forest like a creeping fog. I hadn't planned to stay out this late, but the forest had a way of enclosing me in its secrets, drawing me deeper into its embrace. The tales of old women warned of spirits that wandered these woods, but I had dismissed them as little more than folklore, stories to frighten children. I had believed that until now. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. I stepped carefully, cursing my unsteady footing on the gnarled roots poking up from the ground. The forest floor was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls, each noise amplified in the thickening darkness. I had come searching for answers. I could hear the whispers of my friends' laughter echo in my mind, each of them having a story about the old woman who lived at the forest's edge, her silhouette lurking among the trees. I wanted to prove that there was nothing to fear, that the tales were mere products of overactive imaginations. Yet, with each step I took, a prickling sensation crawled up my spine. The light from my phone illuminated the path ahead, but its weak beam did little against the heavy shadows. I had taken the same trail before, but now it felt foreign, almost hostile. The trees loomed overhead, branches twisted like gnarled fingers, reaching out as if to catch me should I fall. I could feel the forest closing in, and an unsettling chill began to creep into my bones. As I pressed on, I recalled the local legends, the stories of lost souls wandering the woods, lured by the promise of peace but forever trapped in a cycle of torment. I scanned the darkness, half expecting a figure to emerge from behind the trees. Several times, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement, a flicker of white between the trunks, but each time I turned, nothing greeted me but the silence. That silence was unlike any I had experienced. It was as though the very sound had been swallowed whole, leaving a suffocating stillness in its wake. I stopped, straining to hear, to feel something, anything other than the thudding pulse of my heart. My breath quickened as the darkness thickened around me. The stories had always paraded through my mind as fanciful tales, but standing there, the weight of the forest pressed down upon me. I stumbled upon a clearing, a rare pocket of openness surrounded by ancient trees. Moonlight filtered through the branches, casting a silver glow on the tangled underbrush. I took a moment to gather myself. The clearing felt strangely serene, almost inviting, but a cold dread settled in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A rustling sound broke the stillness, softly at first, like the whisper of leaves in the wind. I turned sharply, my breath hitching in my throat. The noise came again, this time louder. I squinted into the shadows, searching for the source, but the darkness seemed to congeal, enveloping whatever stirred beneath its veil. "Hello?" My voice wavered, barely a whisper against the oppressive silence. I felt foolish for calling out, but something compelled me to break the stillness. In response, the rustling grew more pronounced, as if something had shifted, something that had been hiding in the underbrush now revealing itself. My heart raced as I took a step backward, my instinct screaming for me to flee. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and I turned to leave the clearing when something caught my eye. At the edge of the light, standing just outside the perimeter of the moonbeam, a figure emerged. My breath caught in my throat, and my mouth went dry. The figure was a woman, her hair wild and tangled, hanging down her shoulders like a curtain of shadows. She wore a tattered dress that seemed to blend into the forest floor, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, locking onto mine as if she could see into my very soul. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breeze. The words sent a jolt of fear through me. I wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of my car, but I found myself rooted to the spot, caught in the pull of her desperation. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. She took a step closer, and the shadows seemed to ripple around her, twisting unnaturally. "Please," she implored, "I am lost." Her voice trembled, filled with sorrow that seeped into the air between us. "I cannot leave until I find him." The forest seemed to close in tighter. It felt as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for my response. I had heard the stories, the tales of those who had been claimed by the forest, and now I stood face to face with one of its lost souls. "What do you mean?" "Find who?" I stammered, every instinct urging me to back away, but something deeper held me in place. "The one who betrayed me," she said, her eyes reflecting a depth of pain that sent chills down my spine. "He dwells in this forest. He knows what he did." The air thickened with tension as her face twisted into a mask of rage. The shadows around her writhed, echoing her turmoil. I took another step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I turned to leave, I felt a cold hand clasp around my wrist. The grip was firm, almost possessive. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my arm free, stumbling backward until I fell against the rough bark of a tree. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and ran. Branches whipped against me as I darted through the trees, the path now an indistinguishable maze of darkness. I could hear her voice behind me, calling my name, an echoing whisper that seemed to rise above the wind. "Please, don't leave. I need you." I didn't stop to look back. I ran as though the forest itself were alive, chasing me, its secrets clawing at my heels. The laughter of my friends rang hollow in my ears, mere echoes of a life that felt far gone. As I broke through the tree-line, the world outside felt unreal, bright and warm against the cool shadow of the forest I had just fled. But when I turned back, the trees had returned to their stillness, towering sentinels guarding the stories hidden within their depths. I had escaped the darkness, but I knew that I had not escaped unscathed. The encounter had carved itself into my memory, a reminder that some stories are rooted deep in reality, waiting for the curious to uncover what should remain buried. The next morning, I awoke to a thick fog that draped itself over the landscape like a woolen blanket. The sun was a pale disk, barely penetrating the swirling gray. I tossed and turned, the remnants of the previous day's terror gnawing at the back of my mind. The whispers, the shadows, what had I stumbled into? Each creak of the old cabin felt like a warning, but the forest loomed beyond the windows, an eerie reminder of the adventure that had led me here. I had no intention of going back out there, yet my curiosity battled with my instinct for self-preservation. The townsfolk had warned me, but I had ignored their caution, eager to prove myself an intrepid explorer. Now, all I could think of were the stories of those who had entered the forest and never returned. I spent the morning pacing the cabin, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like the mist outside. I rummaged through my supplies, searching for anything that might offer comfort. Amid the clutter of camping gear, I found a small flask filled with the remnants of last night's whiskey. I took a swig, hoping the burn would pull me back into reality. As noon approached, the fog began to lift, revealing the twisted branches of the trees outside. They stood like sentinels, their gnarled forms beckoning me toward the forest's depths. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn to the door. I needed to understand what had happened the previous night. Was it simply the result of fatigue and overactive imagination working overtime? Or was there something more sinister afoot? I donned my jacket and stepped out, the cool air biting at my skin. The forest loomed before me, its shadows stretching long and dark. I hesitated at the edge of the tree line, memories of the whispers echoing in my mind. But I pushed forward, driven by a sense of urgency. With each step into the underbrush, the world behind me faded into silence. I was enveloped by the forest's stillness, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I felt as if I had crossed some invisible boundary, leaving behind civility for the unknown. The trees grew denser, their trunks thick and twisted as if in an eternal struggle against the elements. I pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. I lost all sense of time. The path I had initially followed began to vanish, replaced by a tangled mess of roots and brambles. The air grew thicker, heavier, suffused with the scent of damp earth and decay. Every now and then, I paused, straining to hear any sign of life, but the forest remained eerily quiet. Then I heard it, a soft rustling, like the whisper of leaves stirring in a breeze. My heart raced as I turned, scanning the surroundings. I was alone, yet the unsettling feeling of being watched returned. With every glance over my shoulder, the sensation intensified. It was as if the forest held its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stumbled upon a clearing, the sunlight breaking through the canopy above. The contrast was jarring, and I welcomed it, but the warmth quickly faded as I caught sight of what lay ahead. At the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated structure, half consumed by the forest itself. It was a cabin, similar to mine but older, a relic of a time long forgotten. Its windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring back at me. Cautiously, I approached, a mix of dread and curiosity propelling me forward. The door hung ajar, creaking in the wind. I peered inside, the dimness inside swallowing the light. It seemed untouched by time yet marred by neglect. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the faintest hint of sunlight filtering through the cracked windows. As I stepped inside, a chill washed over me. The air was stale, thick with the weight of unspoken stories. I brushed my fingers along a table, traces of dust coating my skin. In the corner, I spotted a small journal, its pages yellowed and worn. With trembling hands, I opened it, the faintest scent of mildew wafting from its depths. The entries were hastily written, fragmented thoughts spilling onto the pages. Each line narrated the descent into madness of its author, a nameless soul who had ventured into the forest seeking solace from the world. But their words quickly turned dark, warning of figures that lurked just beyond the trees, of whispers that filled the night. The final entry was a frantic scrawl, a plea for help that ended abruptly. My heart raced as I read the chilling words, the sense of dread swelling within me. I slammed the journal shut, my mind racing with the implications. This was no mere story. This was a warning. I needed to leave. But as I turned to leave, a shadow flickered at the edge of the clearing. My breath caught in my throat. I peered cautiously outside, the sunlight now rendering the trees a distorted canvas of dark and light. But I saw nothing. The stillness returned, more oppressive than before. A low whisper echoed through the clearing, and I realized this was not over. I was not alone. I fled the cabin, my pulse pounding in my ears. The forest closed in around me, the trees seeming to twist and writhe as I stumbled back onto the main path. The whispers grew louder, swirling in a chaotic symphony, and I ran blindly, fear driving me deeper into the woods. With every desperate step, I felt the shadows reach for me, as if the forest itself was eager to reclaim what it had lost. I could hear them now, the voices weaving through the trees, a chorus of those who had come before me. I had entered the realm of the forgotten, and there was no turning back. The shadows stretched long and thin as the late afternoon sun slanted through the gaps in the dense canopy above. The forest loomed around me, a living entity, the trees whispering secrets in a language I could almost grasp but never fully understood. I had ventured deeper than I ever intended, the path behind me swallowed by the thick underbrush and twisting roots that seemed to pull me in. After my last encounter near the creek, I had convinced myself to return, to confront the dread that clung to me like a damp fog. The stories about these woods haunted my childhood nightmares, tales of spirits trapped between realms and restless souls punished to wander eternally. I had laughed them off then, but as I pressed forward, the air grew heavier, thick with an unnameable weight that nestled beneath my ribs. I stepped carefully, the forest floor soft beneath my worn boots, muffling my footsteps. Each crack of a twig felt like a thunderclap in the silence. I clutched the small flashlight I had brought, though the fading light seemed to mock my efforts. I had told myself I could handle this. I was no longer the scared child peeking through fingers at the flickering shadows on the wall. Yet, with every step, I felt the child stir deep within me, whispering warnings I dared not acknowledge. After an hour of wandering, I found a clearing. Lush grass blanketed the ground, a serene oasis amid the encroaching chaos of the trees. I sighed in relief, the tension in my shoulders easing slightly. I was tempted to turn back, to retreat to the safety of home, but curiosity gnawed me, a relentless urge to uncover what lurked in the darkened corners of this forest. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient oak, its gnarled branches twisting upwards like skeletal fingers clawing at the clouds. The bark was thick and rough, mottled with age, and I could swear I saw faces etched into the wood, proud and hollow-eyed, trapped in their silent scream. I stepped closer, drawn by a force I didn't understand, as if the tree beckoned me to listen. That was when I heard it, a quiet hum, like a distant chant carried on the wind. The sound sent a shiver racing down my spine. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence that seemed to merge with the beating of my heart. I glanced around, the once comforting clearing now transforming into a stage for dread. I was not alone. I stepped back, my breath hitching in my throat. The air pulsed with energy, and the hum grew louder, enveloping me in its eerie embrace. I turned, searching for the source, but the forest was silent save for that haunting melody. Something flickered at the edge of my vision, a shadow darting between the trees, but when I whirled around, there was nothing. Only the oppressive stillness of the forest and the gnawing sensation of being watched. With a sudden impulse, I crossed the clearing, moving closer to the oak. The nearer I approached, the clearer the chanting became. It was no longer a mere whisper, it was an invocation, a lament, or perhaps a warning. I pressed my palm against the rough bark, a chill racing through me, as if the tree itself was alive, breathing under my touch. And then I saw them. The faces, twisted in a myriad of expressions, some mournful, others contorted in rage. I stumbled back, yanking my hand away as if scalded. The chanting crescendoed, the sound reverberating through the clearing, shaking the leaves and stirring the branches above. Panic clawed at my throat, and I turned to flee. But the path that had led me here was gone, swallowed completely by the forest. I spun around, desperation rising like bile as the shadows deepened, stretching out like the fingers of a malevolent spirit seeking to ensnare me. I called out, my voice cracking, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence answered, yet the hum persisted, a relentless heartbeat in the background. I stumbled forward, my hands outstretched, desperate to find the way back. The trees closed in around me, their bark seeming to shift under my fingertips, as if they were alive and aware of my fear. Panic surged within me. I could hear my pulse thrumming, a frantic rhythm matching the chanting that continued to echo in the vastness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of movement. A figure flickered in the undergrowth, its shape blurred and indistinct. I froze, the air thick around me, my breath quickening as I whispered, "Who's there?" The figure stepped into the dim light. It was a child, no older than 7, dirt smeared across her pale face. Her eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting the fading light, and her hair hung in tangled strands around her shoulders. She stared at me, mouth moving silently as if trapped in a world I could not see. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The child pointed to the trees, her expression shifting from fear to something more sinister. I took a step toward her, a part of me hoping I had imagined the whole thing, that she would lead me back. But then I heard its branches snapping, Leaves rustling as a presence emerged from the shadows. The air thickened with dread as I turned, my heart racing. The child's eyes widened in horror, her finger trembling as she pointed behind me, a silent warning. I dared not turn around, paralyzed by the raw terror coursing through me. Whatever had been awakened by my presence was now moving in the darkness, and I could feel its gaze boring into my back. My instincts kicked in, and I sprang forward, racing through the underbrush, branches clawing at my skin as I fought against the overwhelming sense of despair. I stumbled, falling to my knees, the forest closing in like a noose. Somewhere, the child's voice echoed in my mind, a distant plea for escape. The chant began again, rising in a furious crescendo, surrounding me, drowning me in its dreadful insistence. In those final moments, as I struggled to break free from the grasp of the forest, I understood the truth of the tales I had once dismissed. The woods were alive, and they were hungry. The chill in the air thickened as I stepped deeper into the forest, each footfall muted by the blanket of damp leaves. I had returned to the Thistlewood Grove, the very heart of the tales that had haunted me since childhood. The locals spoke of a darkness that dwelt here, a presence that fed on fear and despair, and now, with every cautious step, I could almost feel it stirring beneath the surface of the forest floor, as if the ground itself were a creature lying in wait. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to stretch and warp, reaching out towards me. The once familiar terrain had morphed into a labyrinth of twisted trees and thick underbrush. I recalled the stories my grandmother told of those who had wandered in and never returned. Had they been consumed by the forest, or had they found something worse? I pressed on, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. A sharp rustling broke the eerie silence, sending a jolt of adrenaline racing through me. I stopped, holding my breath as I scanned the trees, but there was nothing, only the whispering wind carrying a melody that seemed to beckon me further into the darkened woods. I had come seeking answers, driven by the disappearance of my brother, David. The forest had called to him as it had to others, and I needed to understand why. He had always been drawn to the supernatural, a compass pointing toward the unknown. I wished I had listened more closely to his warnings, his frantic tales about the shadows that moved when no one was looking, the faces he claimed to have seen in the bark of the trees. As I trudged onward, the sun dipped lower, casting the world into a sepia tone that felt almost dreamlike. My heart raced at the thought of what might await me. I reached a clearing, an open space that felt wrong somehow. It was too quiet. I could hear my pulse thundering in my ears, a harsh reminder of my isolation. Suddenly, I noticed a figure standing at the far end of the clearing. A girl, with hair like wisps of smoke, her back turned to me. I hesitated, fear clawing at my throat. "Hello?" I called, my voice reverberating off the trees, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence that enveloped me. The girl did not turn. I took a step closer, my instinct screaming at me to run. Was this another of the forest's tricks? I clenched my fists, summoning a fragile courage. "Are you okay?" It was then that she turned slowly, her movements deliberate, as if she had been waiting for me to speak. Her eyes were hollow, like the void of night, reflecting nothing but an unbearable darkness. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a brittle echo. "Where's David?" I croaked, the name tearing from my lips like a desperate prayer. She smiled, but it was a grimace, a distortion of what a smile should be. "He's been waiting," she said, tilting her head in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "He's not alone anymore." I recoiled, the reality of her words hitting me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" "Once you enter the grove, pieces of you stay behind. The forest takes what it needs, and it has claimed him." I stumbled back, shaking my head, trying to dispel the creeping dread that filled my veins. "No, that can't be true." I shouted, but doubt wormed its way into my thoughts. The girl's eyes glimmered with a sad understanding, and I felt the weight of her gaze pierce through me. What happened to him? I demanded, desperate for any scrap of hope. His light dimmed, she replied, her voice dropping to an almost inaudible whisper. He was drawn to the shadows, and they welcomed him. You must leave before it claims you too. The forest seemed to grow darker with each word, the trees closing in as if to trap me within their gnarled embrace. I turned to flee, but the path I had taken had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of foliage. Panic rose in me like bile. Help! I cried, the echo of my voice swallowed by the stillness around me. I could feel the ground vibrating, a low hum that resonated deep within my chest. Stay, she said sweetly, her voice a lure. Stay with us. I gritted my teeth and fought against the pull of her words. I pushed past the fear that threatened to paralyze me and ran in the opposite direction, my heart pounding erratically in my chest. The underbrush tore at my clothes and skin, branches snagging at my arms as I stumbled, desperate to escape the gross grip. I felt the shadows closing in, a massive darkness following my every step, whispering secrets and promises of acceptance. Yet, through it all, I clung to the thought of David, the brother I had loved fiercely, the one I refused to abandon to this nightmare. As I ran, the air around me crackled with energy, the trees seeming to shift and sway, as if alive. I burst through the thicket, gasping for breath, and halted abruptly as I found myself at the edge of the forest. The light of day broke above me like a reprieve, but the dread did not fade. The darkness of Thistlewood had followed me, lurking just beyond the trees, whispering my name in a chorus of voices that promised to unravel everything I had ever known. And I realized then that while I had escaped the forest, I of all people understood it would never truly let me go. Story 6, Lease of the Damned. I had moved into the small apartment on the edge of town with hopes of starting anew. The last year had been a whirlwind of grief and uncertainty, and the fresh coats of paint on the walls felt like a promise of better days. The rent was low, the location secluded, and the landlord, Mr. Grayson, seemed eager to fill his vacancies when we met. I should have sensed the unease lurking beneath his cordial demeanor, but desperation often dulled one's instincts. The apartment was quaint, housed in an old building with weary bones. It creaked and groaned, whispering secrets of its past with every gust of wind. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged wood and dust, as if the very walls had absorbed decades of stories. I spent my first night in silence, save for the distant sounds of the city, reminding me I wasn't entirely alone. I unpacked slowly, trying to make it feel like home. Days turned into weeks, and I settled into a routine. The haunting memories of my past faded under the monotony of life. I learned to appreciate the rhythm of my own breath, the comforting dullness of each day. But soon enough, I noticed something unusual about the building. Whispers carried through the hallways, and shadows flitted just beyond my periphery. My neighbors, all withdrawn and oddly secretive, avoided eye contact and hurried past whenever I tried to engage them. It was after my third week that I first encountered Mr. Grayson again. I had gotten comfortable in the routine of life, too comfortable perhaps, when he knocked on my door one evening. I opened it to find him standing there, a slight smile plastered on his face, but his eyes were vacant, almost sunken. "Just checking in," he said, his voice too smooth, too rehearsed. "How are you finding the place?" "It's nice, thank you," I replied, forcing a smile. "I'm settling in well." He nodded, but his gaze shifted behind me, scanning the room before returning to my face. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. The building has a lot of history, you know." I felt a chill crawl down my spine at the way he said history. It was as if he was sharing a secret, one I wasn't meant to know. I dismissed it as paranoia, closing the door behind him with an uneasy feeling lingering in the air. The next few days were marked by a deepening sense of dread. I began to hear the whispers more clearly, conversations echoing through the walls, always just out of reach, always leaving me feeling like an intruder in their midst. I tried to put it out of my mind, but the unease grew like ivy creeping over brick. One night, the murmurs escalated to frantic exchanges, a cacophony that made it impossible to ignore. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to catch a word, but it was a jumbled mess. Frustrated, I slammed my hand against the wall, and the noise abruptly stopped. Silence filled the air, thick with anticipation. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the whispers to return. After several minutes, the voices returned, softer this time, almost like a shroud being pulled over a secret. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was frantic, desperate. I shuddered and stepped back from the wall, my heart racing. It was late, but sleep eluded me. The next evening, I ran into one of my neighbors in the hallway, a frail man, his hair thinning and his eyes darting nervously. I attempted small talk, asking him how long he had lived there, but he merely nodded at my question, mumbling something unintelligible before hurrying past. I decided to confront Mr. Grayson again. I knocked on his office door the following afternoon, my hands trembling slightly. He welcomed me in with his usual smile, but I noticed the way his eyes narrowed, assessing me. I wanted to ask about the noise, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Is there a problem with the plumbing? It seems like there's a lot of commotion at night. Mr. Grayson chuckled lightly, a sound that felt more like a warning than a reassurance. Ah, the building has its quirks. Old pipes, you know. Sometimes, the occupants of the past can be a bit noisy. But nothing to worry about. His words struck a chord of fear within me. The occupants of the past. I felt the air shift, an unseen weight pressing against my chest. I forced a smile, nodding as I backed out of his office, the door clicking shut behind me with a finality that sent shivers down my spine. That night, I could hear the whispers again, but now they were laced with urgency. I pressed my ear against the wall, desperate to grasp what was being said, but it was always just out of reach, an unanswered riddle that clung to my mind like a haunting melody. Sleep eluded me entirely as I lay awake, the clock ticking louder than the voices surrounding me. As the days wore on, I became increasingly aware of every creak and groan of the building, every shadow lurking in my periphery. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, a chorus of despair that made my skin crawl. I felt watched, hunted even, as if the building itself had eyes, its very structure alive with a history I dared not uncover. Each interaction with my neighbors left me feeling more isolated, more trapped in this web of silence and secrets. I decided then that I would have to dig deeper, to unravel the threads that bound the residents of this cursed place. But even as I resolved to seek the truth, a small voice in the back of my mind warned me to turn back, to leave before it was too late. Yet, I was far too curious now, drawn deeper into the shadowed history that loomed over me like a dark cloud, waiting to unleash its storm. And somewhere within those walls, something waited, too, patient and hungry, just beyond my understanding. The soft hum of the morning light seeped through the cracks of the blinds, painting the room in muted shades of beige and gold. The world outside felt distant, almost unreal. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the collection of boxes that had yet to be unpacked. It had been 2 weeks since I moved into the old Victorian house I now called home, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a grave mistake. I had been drawn to the house, its peeling paint and creaky floorboards whispering stories of the past. The landlord, Mr. Hawthorne, had a warm smile and a quick charm that put me at ease during our initial meeting. He had spoken of the house's history with pride, painting a picture of a bygone era that felt almost magical. But as I explored the dimly lit corridors and dusty corners, an unsettling air clung to the place, a weight I couldn't quite place. After a restless night, I reluctantly climbed out of bed and made my way to the kitchen, hoping to brew some coffee strong enough to chase away the remnants of my nightmares. The kettle hissed as it heated, and I could hear the faint sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. As I waited, I glanced out of the window, catching a glimpse of Mr. Hawthorne tending to the garden. He was hunched over, his weathered hands working through the soil, but something about the way he moved sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if he was more a part of the earth than a man, rooted in the ground, unyielding. The coffee brewed, filling the small kitchen with a comforting aroma, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It had been 3 days since I had heard the strange noises, a low, almost melodic hum echoing through the house at night. The sound seemed to seep from the walls, resonating deep in my bones, and when I tried to trace it back, I found nothing. Just silence, oppressive and thick. With my mug in hand, I decided to explore the house further. I had already seen the kitchen, the small living room adorned with dusty furniture, and my cramped bedroom, but I was drawn to the basement. Mr. Hawthorne had mentioned it briefly during the tour, almost dismissively, as if it were an afterthought. "Not much down there," he had said with a wave of his hand. But my curiosity nodded me. The basement door creaked as I opened it, a chill escaping into the hallway. I hesitated, the dim light from the single bulb above flickering as if the darkness itself was trying to claw its way up the stairs. I descended slowly, each step sending vibrations through the wooden staircase, as though the house was alive and aware of my presence. At the bottom, I found myself in a small space filled with shadows. Old furniture lay strewn about, covered in dust sheets, and the air felt stale, as if it had been trapped for decades. I flipped the switch on the wall, and the light sputtered, casting eerie shapes that danced across the walls. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved deeper into the room, my eyes scanning the corners. I stumbled upon an old trunk, its surface marred by time, and felt an inexplicable compulsion to open it. As I lifted the lid, the air shifted, and the faint hum returned, vibrating through the wood. Inside the trunk, I found yellow papers and photographs, faces I didn't recognize, families long gone. A chill snaked up my spine as I sifted through them, feeling as though I had unearthed something that should have remained buried. Suddenly, a soft footfall echoed behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but only the shadows greeted me. A flicker of movement caught my eye, and I turned my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. I hurriedly closed the trunk, my breath catching in my throat. The sensation of being watched intensified, prickling the back of my neck. I made my way up the stairs, the feeling of dread pooling in my stomach. As I reached the top, I came face to face with Mr. Hawthorne, standing in the hallway, frozen mid-step. His eyes bore into mine, a knowing glint that sent a jolt of fear through me. "Exploring the basement, I see," he said, his voice smooth yet tinged with an underlying tension. "It can be quite a spooky place. Best not to spend too long down there." My voice faltered, the words catching in my throat. I just wanted to see what was down there. He smiled politely, but it didn't reach his eyes. Old houses have a way of holding onto memories. Some more than others. He paused, his gaze drifting over my shoulder, as if sensing the presence I had felt. "Let me know if you need anything. I'm just a knock away." With that, he turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing unnaturally down the corridor. I watched him disappear around the corner, my heart racing. The basement felt more like a tomb than a storage space, its secrets lingering just out of reach. As I stood there, the noise returned, a low, rhythmic hum echoing through the walls, wrapping around me like a shroud. I pressed my hand against the wall, feeling the vibrations beneath my fingertips, and with it came the realization that I was not just living in this house, I was becoming a part of its story, whether I wanted to or not. And I was terrified by what I might find next. The air in the apartment felt heavier than usual, as if it had absorbed the tension swirling around me. It was morning, yet the sunlight was muted, filtered through grimy window panes that hadn't seen a wash in years. After the events of the previous evening, I struggled to shake the feeling of being trapped in a waking nightmare. I had barely slept, tossing and turning while replaying the landlord's unsettling behavior in my mind. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant whisper from behind the walls, made my heart race. I could still feel the oppressive weight of his gaze as he stood too close, the smell of stale cigarettes and something else, something rancid, still clinging to my clothes. That last comment he had made, about my getting settled in, echoed in my head, twisting into a grotesque chant. I needed to clear my head, to remind myself that rationality still existed. I stood up, stretched, and decided to make coffee, longing for the comfort of caffeine to shake the remnants of anxiety. Each footstep felt like an intrusion in the silence, the noise echoing across the room. I fumbled with the coffee maker, my fingers trembling slightly as I filled the reservoir with water. The machine sputtered to life, and I let out a deep breath, leaning against the counter. Maybe I was overreacting. Landlords were supposed to be odd, right? Especially one who had been managing a building for as long as I could guess. I had heard rumors about him, whispers among the tenants on the lower floors, but they had seemed like petty gossip until now. As the rich aroma of coffee filled the room, I decided to take a moment to organize my thoughts. I grabbed my notebook and started jotting down everything I knew about the building. The cold, encroaching dread settled into my stomach like lead as I traced the pattern of lines and disjointed notes, tenant turnover rates, odd maintenance issues, and the strange, unexplainable accidents that seemed to plague others. It was a map of unease. Just as I was swirling my thoughts into coherent sentences, a loud thump echoed from the apartment above me. I froze, pen hovering above the page, heart pounding. Was someone up there? The tenant in 3B rarely made noise. I had never heard so much as a chair scraping against the floor. Curiosity mixed with dread, and I stood up, still clutching the pen. I crept toward the door, listening intently. Another thump, closer this time, followed by what sounded like a muffled voice, a pleading, almost whimpering sound. My heart raced as I glanced at the door, the peeling paint seeming to tremble along with my nerves. I couldn't just ignore it. It wasn't my problem, and yet, I felt a compulsion to investigate. I stepped out of my apartment and into the hallway, the air thickening as I moved toward the staircase. Each step above me creaked alarmingly, but still, I pressed on, the instinct to help overriding everything else. I reached the door to 3B and raised my hand, hesitating just for a moment before knocking softly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is everything all right?" Silence followed, thick and unsettling. I knocked again, louder this time, fear worming its way into my gut. The muffled sounds had stopped, replaced by an eerie quiet. I glanced back down the stairs, the dim light filtering through the windows casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. Finally, a voice responded, faint and shaky, "Please, help me." I couldn't just leave, not after hearing that. I knocked again, this time harder. "Are you okay? What's going on in there?" "Please, you have to get me out," the voice implored, desperation dripping from every syllable. He's gone mad." My stomach dropped. I didn't know who he was, but instinct urged me to act. I twisted the doorknob, only to find it locked. I pressed my shoulder against the door, feeling the cold weight against my skin, and called out again, "Can you unlock the door?" There was a brief pause, a shuffle, then the sound of the lock clicking open. The door creaked ajar, revealing a dim interior that smelled of decay and fear. I swallowed hard, stepping inside slowly. The apartment was a scene from a horror movie. Dark curtains hung askew, blocking out the sunlight, and the walls were stained with damp patches. The floor was littered with discarded wrappers and broken furniture, but it was the figure huddled in the far corner that gripped my attention. The woman, her name had been something like Julia, looked disheveled and terrified, her eyes wild. "He'll come back," she whispered, curling into herself. "You have to hide. He's not right." "He's not." Her voice trailed off, and I caught the flicker of something behind her. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer despite my instinct screaming at me to retreat. I shouldn't have said anything," she stammered, her breathing rapid. "You don't understand. He'll know." Before I could respond, a loud bang erupted from the front door of the apartment building. I turned toward the sound, my heart racing. It was a voice, a booming, authoritative voice. "Open up. I know you're in there." My body froze as we both exchanged terrified glances. Julia's face was pale, her lips trembling. "Please," she gasped, "you have to go. He can't find you here. You don't want to get involved." But it was too late. I could hear the footsteps, heavy and measured, approaching our door. "Get down," I hissed, instinctively crouching beside her as the door rattled on its hinges. A glimmer of courage surged through me, mixed with fear. "We can't let him in." The handle turned, slowly creaking, and all I could think was that this was the beginning of something I might never escape. The next week passed in a haze of dread. Each evening, as I returned to my apartment, the walls seemed to close in a little tighter. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even when the only companion in the silence was the rattle of the old radiator. I had intended to confront Mr. Jenkins about the noises, the whispers that crept through the thin walls, but I found myself hesitating. Something in the way he had looked at me the last time had planted seeds of fear deep in my mind. On Tuesday night, I was woken abruptly by a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible scratch at my door. The clock blinked 2:17 a.m., its digital glow casting a sickly light around the room. I held my breath, straining to hear through the stale air. The scratching persisted for a few moments before it stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that hummed like fog. I slipped from my bed, heart hammering, and crept toward the door. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it simply the building settling? Or was it something else? I edged closer, placing a trembling hand on the doorknob and pausing to listen again. All I could hear was the quiet thud of my heart. Gathering my courage, I swung open the door. The hallway was dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of a single flickering bulb. No one was there. I leaned out, peering left and right, but all I saw were shadows dancing along the walls. The air smelled stale, punctuated by an underlying scent of something foul like damp earth. I nearly closed the door when something caught my eye at the end of the hallway. A flicker of movement. It was Mr. Jenkins, standing eerily still, just outside his apartment door across from mine. His back was to me, but I could see the outline of his lanky frame, his head bent as if he were listening intently to something just beyond the wall. "Mr. Jenkins?" I called out, my voice barely breaking the stillness. He didn't respond, remaining motionless, as if he hadn't heard me. It was unsettling, his silence, almost predatory. I took a hesitant step back, ready to close my door, but before I could, he turned his head slowly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his eyes. They were dark, sunken, the skin around them a shade too pale. The faintest smile curled his lips, and in that moment, I felt a rush of ice water fear course through me. "Good evening, Clara," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "Trouble sleeping?" I forced a smile, though it felt brittle on my lips. "Just thought I heard something." "Ah, the old building. It creaks and groans. Always a little spooky, isn't it?" He chuckled softly, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Yeah, I suppose it is," I replied, my heart racing. "Well, I should." "Before you go," he interrupted, stepping forward with an unsettling grace, "I wanted to check in on you. You're settling in well, I hope." "Why, yes, thank you," I stammered, edging the door closed. The gap between us narrowed, his presence suffocating. Just fine." "I see." He paused, his gaze unwavering, dissecting me like a specimen. "I've heard you've had some concerns." "About the plumbing?" "Right," I said, desperate to change the subject. "I'll, get to it." "Busy week?" "Yes, busy indeed," he said slowly, a predatory glint in his eyes. "But remember, Clara, I'm always here if you need anything. Don't hesitate." With that, he stepped back, allowing me to close the door with a shaky exhale. I leaned against it, struggling to regain my composure. Was he checking on me or watching me? The line between concern and menace had blurred. Days passed, and I found myself avoiding Mr. Jenkins whenever possible. I stayed up later, finding distractions in books and movies, but the whispers began to escalate. They were faint at first, like the rustle of leaves just outside my window, but soon morphed into hushed murmurs that filled the silence of night. I could never make out the words, just an undercurrent of anxiety that wrapped around me like a fog. Then came the night I noticed the first change. I woke to find a small object on my kitchen table, a rusty key, unmarked and old. It lay there in the dim light, an invitation or a warning. My heart raced as I picked it up, examining it under the lukewarm glow of the lamp. There was something unnerving about it, as if it held the weight of secrets long buried. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that it was a message. But from whom? Why would Mr. Jenkins leave it? Exhausted, I finally gave in to sleep, only to be jolted awake again by a commotion outside my window. The sound of footsteps echoed in the still night, accompanied by half-hearted chatter. I approached the window cautiously, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. A group of shadows gathered in the alley, their laughter ringing hollow against the brick walls. They seemed oblivious to the darkness, enjoying a camaraderie that felt foreign to me. I turned away, feeling the weight of loneliness settle heavily in my chest. But as I did, I caught a glimpse of movement just beneath my window. Mr. Jenkins stood there, staring up at my window, his expression unreadable. I froze, heart pounding. What was he doing out there at this hour? Suddenly, he turned abruptly, disappearing into the dark alley, leaving me with a sense of impending dread. I felt the walls closing in once more, and the whispers resumed, swirling around me like a suffocating fog. Despite the fear that gripped me, I was determined to find out what was happening in this building, what lay beneath the surface of Mr. Jenkins' unsettling facade and my own spiraling paranoia. As the night deepened, I resolved to face whatever horrors awaited me. Whatever this building held, the secrets would no longer remain buried. I would uncover the truth, no matter what dark shadows I had to confront. The sun dipped below the jagged skyline of the crumbling buildings that surrounded my apartment, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and weave like fingers across the pavement. It was a Wednesday, though in the haze of fear and confusion, the days blended into one another. I stood in front of my door, the peeling paint and warped wood had become all too familiar, each day revealing more of its hidden character. But today, the door felt different. It felt like a barrier, a threshold to something sinister. I had reported the strange noises, the scratching, the low thumping that echoed through the walls at night to Mr. Carter, my landlord. He'd brushed it off as the sounds of an old building settling, or perhaps rats in the walls. I remembered the way he smiled then, a sly curling of lips that failed to reach his eyes. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, as if he was measuring my reactions, gauging how much fear he could instill before I would succumb to his demands. That evening, I decided to confront him. I knocked on his door on the first floor, the paint of which was chipped and faded, like him. He answered after a moment, his thin frame framed in the doorway, a suspicious gleam in his eyes. The dim light from the hallway cast a pallor across his face, accentuating the deep lines etched around his mouth. "Ah, Miss Harper," he said, his voice oily. "What brings you here?" "I need to talk about the noises." "They're getting worse," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though a shiver ran down my spine at the thought of those restless nights. He stepped aside and gestured for me to enter. The air in his apartment was thick and musty, a stale odor that clung to the walls. The dim light flickered as I crossed the threshold, illuminating the clutter of old newspapers and an array of half-finished projects scattered about like remnants of a life half-lived. "Have a seat," he offered, his tone deceptively genial. I hesitated before sitting on an old, frayed couch that seemed to absorb any warmth around it. "I think something's wrong with the building. I've heard things, sounds that don't seem right. Maybe you should." "Maybe you should get some sleep," he interrupted sharply, his demeanor shifting. "Old buildings have their quirks. You're letting your imagination run wild." The way he said it felt like a warning. I wanted to press further, to argue, but the way his eyes burned into me made me hesitate. Instead, I glanced at the framed photographs that hung crookedly on the wall. They were all of past tenants' smiling faces caught in moments of joy, each one staring out over my shoulder, as if they were watching me. As I left his apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. I returned to my own unit, closing the door softly behind me, almost reverently. The scratching had intensified, now accompanied by a low, mournful wailing that seemed to seep through the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster, hoping to discern its source. It came from the apartment 2 floors down, the one that had been vacant when I moved in. My heart raced as I imagined something lurking in the dark corners of that space. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? I could already hear their dismissive laughter echoing back at me, another paranoid tenant. The next few days dragged on with an unbearable heaviness. I developed a routine at work, come home, listen. The sounds were relentless, a ceaseless reminder of an unseen presence. I avoided Mr. Carter, felt his eyes on me as I slipped by his apartment, but I was too afraid to engage him. Then, one night, I found a note slipped under my door. "Come to the basement at midnight." My hands trembled as I read it. The note was typed, dull and lifeless, devoid of any signature. My mind raced. I thought about reporting it to the police, but I had no tangible proof, just a note that could easily be ignored. But something compelling urged me to go. As the clock approached midnight, I felt a pull deeper than my fear, a longing to uncover the truth of this building that had turned my life into a waking nightmare. I descended the narrow, creaking stairs to the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The concrete walls felt damp and oppressive, and I shivered as I reached the bottom. Flickering fluorescent lights illuminated the space, revealing a clutter of forgotten boxes and furniture, remnants of lives left behind. And then I saw him, Mr. Carter, standing in the shadows, his back to me. I instinctively stepped back, but he turned, his expression eager and predatory. "Glad you could make it," he said, his voice almost a whisper, a serpentine hiss that slithered through the air. "What is this about?" I demanded, my voice shaking with indignation and terror. "About the building," he said, a gleam in his eyes that sent chills down my spine. "It's alive, you see. It needs to be fed." Before I could comprehend his words, laughter echoed off the walls, mingling with the low wails I had heard before. I turned to run, but the darkness wrapped around me like a suffocating shroud. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as I felt a cold grip on my wrist. "Don't be scared," Mr. Carter said, his smile widening. revealing teeth too sharp for comfort. "You're one of us now." In that moment, I realized the true horror of my situation. This building was a prison, and the landlord was its keeper, feeding off the fears of tenants like me. I was trapped, ensnared in a web I had unwittingly walked into. I fought against his grip, but I could feel the shadows closing in, pulling me deeper into the darkness, where every fear I had ever held was waiting to consume me whole.